They told me time would soften the edges. Whoever came up with that never stood in a quiet living room at 3 a.m., staring at an empty picture frame where an entire life used to hang. My name is Daniel Hayes, and for 27 years, this town has whispered the same question every time the wind shifts over the pines. What really happened to Molly Carter? I was there the night she vanished. I was the one who found the bicycle. And I am the only one left who still hears her voice. At my age, most men talk about blood pressure, hip replacements, and grandkids' soccer games. I talk about a little girl in a yellow raincoat who never came home from the yard, a cold case file that gathers dust in a locked cabinet, and a sound on my porch every November that shouldn't exist. People assume the unexplained lives in big places' deserts, oceans, fancy documentaries with slow zooms and ominous music. But the strangest thing I've ever seen didn't happen in the Bermuda Triangle or some haunted asylum. It happened 3 doors down from my own house, on a perfectly ordinary cul-de-sac, under a sky so clear you could count every single star. The night Molly disappeared, the stars didn't blink. The world just hiccuped. If you're expecting a neat story with a beginning, middle, and end, this might not be for you. I can give you a beginning. I can certainly give you a middle. The end, that's trickier. What I can promise is the truth as I lived it, and the things I've heard since then that no sane man should admit out loud. It started with a knock, not the frantic, panicked pounding you see in movies. Just a polite, almost apologetic knock on my door at 6:42 p.m. on a Thursday in late October, 1998. I remember the time because the 6 o'clock news was still droning in the background, chewing over some election poll no one remembers now. I opened the door, and there she was. 8 years old, freckles, brown hair in 2 braids, yellow raincoat, even though the forecast was clear. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "Mom says it's okay if you come watch the meteor shower with us. Dad's working late." I wasn't family, not really. Just the neighbor with the strange job and the habit of fixing everyone's broken porch lights. At the time, I was a crime reporter for our local paper, the Briarwood Herald. Back then, that meant something. People read your words with their morning coffee. They knew your byline, like they knew the names of the people on their street. I didn't know that within 24 hours. I'd see my own name printed above the word tragedy. Meteor shower? I asked, pretending I'd forgotten. "Mom says it's a Perseid. Perseid," Molly said, over-enunciating like kids do when they're proud of a hard word. She made hot chocolate, with the good marshmallows. I'd already planned to watch the sky from my own back step, but Helen Carter's hot chocolate was a religious experience, and Molly knew how to sell it. "Let me grab my jacket," I said. "Tell your mom I'm on my way." She grinned, flashed the kind of smile that makes you think the world isn't as broken as her job says it is, and ran off across the yard. I watched her go, little yellow streak cutting through the gray of the early evening. Here's the part I never told anyone. As she ran past the maple tree at the edge of my yard, every hair on my arm stood up. No sound, no flash of light, just that deep, instinctive sensation you get sometimes, like your bones suddenly remembered a storm they lived through 50 years ago. I shook it off. A man who spends his days writing about knife wounds in courtrooms learns to ignore his body's alarms. You'd never get anything done otherwise. The Carters lived 3 houses down, pale blue siding, wind chimes on the porch. When I got there a few minutes later, the front door was cracked open, and Jane, their beagle, was sitting on the steps with her head tilted, listening. "Hey, girl," I said, scratching behind her ears. "You guarding the universe tonight, or what?" She whined softly and looked past me, toward the street. Later, in statement after statement, everyone would say the same thing. It was just an ordinary night. The thing about ordinary is that it's only obvious in hindsight. At the time, it's just life, mailboxes, porch lights. Someone's radio faint in the distance. Helen met me at the door with a blanket draped over her shoulder and that exhausted half-smile parents wear like armor. "Dan, you came," she said. "I was starting to think the meteor shower would have better attendance than my coffee table." "You said good marshmallows," I replied. "You can't throw language like that around and not expect consequences." She laughed, and for a second, everything in the world was exactly where it belonged. We stepped out into the backyard, the same backyard you've seen 100 times. Rusted swing set, plastic sandbox, one stubborn patch of dandelions. The sky was already deepening, flecks of early stars pricking through the blue. Charlie Carter, Molly's father, really was working late. I'd covered enough of his cases. He was a public defender to know that when a trial ran long, nobody saw their family until the jury got bored. "Molly's just grabbing her flashlight," Helen said. "She insists on being the one to guide us through the cosmos." I didn't know that would be the last sentence I'd ever hear her say without a tremor in it. Minutes passed. We set out lawn chairs. Helen tried to find the right station on a little portable radio and gave up when all she could get was static and some preacher talking about Revelation. "Molly," she finally called, "you're missing your own show." Silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. Not the comfortable quiet of two adults sharing a night sky. It was dense, like the air itself had come in on a different frequency. The crickets shut up all at once, which I only noticed because my brain went looking for a noise to hang on to and found nothing. "Maybe she's at your place?" Helen said, half joking, half hopeful. "You two are conspiracy buddies now, after that article about the sinkholes." Sinkholes. God, we thought that was our biggest fear back then, dirt suddenly opening up under your feet. I remember checking my watch. 7:03 p.m. It's funny how your mind decides which details to laminate and which to shred. "I just came from my place," I said. She ran ahead of me. Helen frowned. "Molly, honey?" We searched the house first. Bedrooms, bathroom, closet where she liked to hide during thunderstorms. Helen's voice climbed a note higher each time she called her name, until it wasn't really a name anymore, just a sound no one wants to hear come out of a mother. "I'll check outside," I said, my mouth going dry. Maybe she went to show someone the meteor shower. Our neighborhood wasn't the sort of place where people locked their doors before 8. We traded pies and lawnmowers, not threats. But there's a change you can feel in a street when a child's name turns from casual to urgent. Porch lights clicked on up and down Maple Lane like a slow-motion domino line. I walked the front yards, calling, "Molly," trying to keep my tone calm. "Hey, Molly, you're missing the good marshmallows." Nothing. Then I saw the bicycle. It was lying on its side near the end of the cul-de-sac, front wheel still spinning lazily, handlebars twisted at an angle that didn't make sense if someone had carefully laid it down. One pedal was slowly ticking back and forth with the wind. There are moments your brain photographs before you even know why. The bent reflector, the little sticker of a shooting star on the frame, the way the back tire traced a faint scuff in the asphalt, like it had skidded just a little before falling. "Molly?" I said again, but my voice was already somewhere else, years down the road, sitting in a courtroom or writing a headline. I picked up the bike and felt something that would keep me awake for the next 2 decades. The metal was still warm. "Dan?" I turned. Helen was standing in the middle of the street, barefoot, hair pulled up in a messy knot, eyes too wide. "Where is she?" she asked. Not, "Did you find her?" Not, "Is she okay?" Just straight to the part that mattered. I looked at the bike. I looked at the dark stretch of woods beyond the end of the road. I listened for anything footsteps, a giggle, the distant hum of a car. What I heard instead was a sound I've never been able to explain. Imagine a tape recorder being stopped, not fast, not slow, just decisively. A soft click inside your own head. The feeling you get in an airplane right before it hits turbulence, when your stomach knows before the pilot does. Then, somewhere between the houses, a single dog barked. Not Jane from the Carter porch. A deeper bark. A dog I didn't recognize. 3 barks. Silence. Call 911, I said. People love to fantasize about how they'd react in a crisis heroic, composed, saying all the right things. The truth is, most of us become simple. We see a shape on the ground, and we pick it up. We hear a mother's voice crack, and we say the one sentence we know how to say. Call 911. The next hour is a blur of blue and red lights, radios, dogs, neighbors, dogs, neighbors in coats thrown over pajamas. You've seen that footage 100 times. The search lines, the flashlights combing the ditch, the detective with the clipboard. But there are things the camera never catches. The way Helen's hands shook when she handed a photo of Molly to the deputy. The way our pastor from St. Andrews showed up without his collar, just a faded flannel shirt, as if even God needed to dress down for what was coming. They questioned me, of course. I was the last non-family adult to see her. I told them everything, right up until the part about the sound in my head. Try explaining that to a man who has a badge and a limited sense of humor. Mr. Hayes, did you see any vehicles? No. Anyone unfamiliar walking in the area? No. Did Molly say anything unusual? Unusual. The words sat there between us like something fragile. She was excited about the meteor shower, I said. Said she'd guide us through the cosmos. The deputy scribbled that down, like it might be useful. It wasn't. Not to them, anyway. The first 24 hours of a missing child case are supposed to be the most important. I learned that long before Molly. Training, seminars, articles I wrote that nobody remembers now. I knew the stats, the probabilities, the sickening little charts. But there's no chart for what happens to a town's soul in those first hours. By midnight, they had a command post set up at the community center. Coffee, maps, volunteers. A grainy school photo of Molly printed and taped to the wall. I watched as the simple facts of her life age, height, last seen wearing, were turned into bullet points on a form. 8 years boiled down to 3 lines. Sometime around 3 a.m., after the first wave of searchers staggered back in, muddy and empty-handed, I stepped outside for air. The sky was still unbelievably clear. I remember looking up and thinking, the medias are still going, and she's not here to see them. Then, from somewhere behind the building, I heard it. A giggle. Light, quick, undeniably a child's. I froze. For a second, every rational part of my brain rebelled. Kids laugh all the time. Maybe someone brought their daughter. Maybe a TV was on inside. Maybe, hello? I called softly, following the sound around the side of the building. The gravel crunched under my shoes. The floodlights from the parking lot cast long, warped shadows along the brick wall. The air felt colder than it should have been for late October, the kind of cold that settles behind your eyes instead of on your skin. Hello? I said again. Molly? Silence. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it clearly, right next to my left ear, like someone standing shoulder to shoulder with me. Mr. Hayes? I spun around so fast I nearly slipped on the gravel. No one was there. Just my own breath making little clouds in the air. I don't scare easy. Years of crime scenes will sand that down in you. But in that moment, some ancient animal part of me decided that I was not alone, and that whatever was with me was not something I could put in a headline. The next day, they found nothing. The next week, nothing. The case slipped from urgent to ongoing to open pending to that quiet corner of the filing cabinet where hope goes to hibernate. The official story became simple. Molly Carter, age 8, vanished without a trace from a quiet suburban street. No suspects, no body, no closure. But that's not the whole story. Because over the years that followed, on nights when the sky is clear and the wind is just right, I kept hearing it. The knock on the door, the soft giggle. Sometimes, if I let my mind drift too far, I can still feel the warmth of that bicycle frame in my hands. And a few weeks ago, 27 years after the night she disappeared, something happened that forced me to open that cabinet, pull out the old file, and finally write all of this down. It started with a photograph that shouldn't exist. Someone mailed it to me. No return address. No note. Just an old-fashioned printed photo, the kind you pick up from a drugstore. In it, a little girl stood at the edge of a wooded trail, half turned toward the camera like she'd been caught mid-step. Yellow raincoat. Freckles. Braids. On the back, in small, neat handwriting, were 3 words and a date. Still searching, Dan. Dated exactly 1 day before Molly disappeared. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped it. Because there was one more detail the sender couldn't have faked. The photo had a faint, ghostly smear in the top corner, like the film had been double exposed with a streak of light. A streak I recognized. I'd seen that shape once before. In the sky, the night the world hiccuped, and an 8-year-old girl vanished into thin air. So if you're listening to this because you love mysteries, or cold cases, or ghost stories dressed up as police reports, you're going to get all of that. But you're also going to get a confession. Because what I haven't told anyone, not the police, not the Carters, not my editor at the Herald, is that I think Molly's case has never really been cold. I think something on this planet, something we don't have the right words for, borrowed her. And I think, for the first time in 27 years, it's trying to give her back. And that's where this part of the story begins. The morning after the photograph arrived, Briarwood looked exactly the way a town should look when nothing is wrong. School buses groaned down Maple Lane, sprinklers clicked to life on autopilot, and somebody's radio 2 streets over mumbled country music about heartbreak and pickup trucks. I sat at my kitchen table with the photo propped up against a chipped mug, trying to convince myself that the girl in the yellow raincoat was a coincidence, an echo of a memory my brain wanted to see. But the handwriting on the back, the small, steady letters spelling, "Still searching, Dan," clung to my thoughts like smoke. Only 3 people ever called me Dan in that exact way. My mother, who'd been in the ground 12 years. An old editor who drunk himself into a quiet retirement. And Helen Carter, who hadn't said more than 2 polite words to me in nearly a decade. I should have taken the photo straight to the police. That's what the rational part of me repeated like a mantra as I turned it over and over, tracing the date with my thumb. 1 day before Molly vanished. It made no sense. Film photos took time processing, printing. Back in '98, you didn't snap a picture and have it in your hand an hour later, unless you lived next door to a 1-hour photo booth. And even then, why would anyone date it forward? The picture felt wrong in my hands, like a letter written from a place time didn't run in a straight line. At 59, a man either decides he's going senile, or he admits there are things he can't explain. I'd spent my career training people to trust facts, and now the facts themselves were starting to bend. By 10:30, the sunlight had pushed far enough across my linoleum floor to set the photo's glossy surface aglow. It was that shimmer that finally shoved me out of my chair. If I stared at any longer, I was going to start hearing her giggle again, and once that door opened, it was hard to close. I slid the picture into a manila envelope, wrote my own address on the back, like a fool who wanted a return to sender stamped by the universe, and stepped outside. The air had that brittle edge our falls get here, cool without apology, scented with pine and distant wood smoke. Maple Lane had aged since '98. New coats of paint, new fences, different cars in the driveways. Human beings are stubborn. They replant flowers and replace siding as if cosmetics can erase the memory of search dogs and floodlights. The Carter house stood 3 doors down. Pale blue paint faded now to something closer to fog. The wind chimes on the porch were still there, tangled in each other, silent. For years after Molly disappeared, I'd gone out of my way not to walk past that house. You learn to reroute yourself. You take the long way around the block. You pretend you forgot an errand. You stare at the cracks in the sidewalk instead of at the windows. The first time I saw Helen on her porch, after the search was officially scaled back, she was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes on nothing. I raised my hand in a half-wave. She looked through me as if I were something the sun had burned onto her vision. After that, distance became our truce. This time, I made myself take the direct route. Third house on the right. Jane, the old beagle, was long gone. A ceramic angel now sat in the flower bed where she used to dig. Someone had repainted the porch railings, but left one slat slightly crooked. That crooked board had a story. I'd fixed it once, years back, when Molly tripped on it and skinned her knee. The past and present overlapped for a second, and I had to steady myself on the mailbox. I was raising my hand to knock when the door opened. Helen stood there, thinner than I remembered, hair shot through with silver, eyes carved deeper into her face. Time had chiseled away at her, but there was a stubborn core that hadn't shifted. For a heartbeat, we just stared. Her gaze flicked to the envelope in my hand like a magnet finding north. "Dan," she said, and it came out on a breath like she'd been rehearsing saying my name and finally decided to try out the line. "Helen." My voice sounded older than I expected. I realized I hadn't heard it much outside of my own four walls lately. "I got something in the mail." I thought. "Come in," she said. No hesitation, no awkward half-step. Just 2 words, and a tilt of the head that dropped us both through time. The Carter living room had always been cozy, cramped in a way that says family instead of clutter. Toys in corners, throw blankets, picture frames at mismatched angles. Now it was tidy to the point of emptiness. The same couch, but no Lego pieces lurking under it. The TV had upgraded, but the entertainment center still bore faint white lines where old photo frames had sat for years and then been moved. On the far wall, exactly where it had always hung, was the family photo I dreaded and needed to see. Helen, younger, Charlie with more hair, and Molly perched between them. A gap-toothed grin splitting her face. Time had dulled the colors, but not the way Helen's hand curled protectively around Molly's shoulder. "Sit," Helen said softly, gesturing to the couch. "Do you still take your coffee black?" I blinked. "Yeah, I do." "Good. I can still make at least one thing the same." While she moved into the kitchen, I sat on the edge of the couch, envelope in my hands suddenly heavy as a brick. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something underneath it. Hot chocolate powder, maybe. Old habit smell. I looked at the TV stand and saw, in the ghost lines of dust, where a framed school portrait had once stood. You can tell more about a person by what's missing than what's displayed. Helen came back with 2 mugs and set them on the coffee table. Her hands trembled just enough that the spoons chimed against the ceramic. She sat in the armchair opposite me, leaned forward, and nodded at the envelope. "Show me," she said. I swallowed. I don't know who sent it. No return address. It just appeared yesterday. She didn't say anything, just watched my hands as I slid the photo out and turned it so she could see. The moment her eyes landed on it, the room changed temperature. It was like someone had cracked a window in a blizzard. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, God. I thought it looked like—" "It is." Her voice was sharp, not with anger, but with the ferocity of recognition. She stood, stepped closer, and took the photo from me with surprising gentleness, like it might break or cut her. "That's her. That's my baby." The little girl in the picture stared up from the glossy paper, frozen in mid-step on some wooded path. The yellow raincoat, the braids, The way her left shoe was slightly untied details no stranger would think to include. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was Molly, caught on film in a moment no one in this town remembered seeing. "Helen," I said carefully, "turn it over." She did, reading the handwriting on the back. "Still searching, Dan." Her lips shaped my name, and the words like a question and accusation rolled into one. This looks like my writing," she whispered, "but I never wrote this." I would remember? I felt a chill crawl up from my spine to my scalp. "The date," I said. "Look at the date." She did, and her knees buckled just slightly. She sat back down without taking her eyes off the numbers. "The day before," she murmured. "The day before she—" Before that night. Neither of us said, disappeared. Some words are too worn out to carry what they're supposed to anymore. We sat in silence while the clock above the TV ticked in the background, each second drawing another breath of disbelief. Then Helen looked up at me, eyes sharper than they'd been in years. "Why now?" She asked. "Why send this now?" "I don't know," I said, "but this isn't the first." Strange thing, Helen. Saying it out loud felt like stepping onto thin ice. I've heard her, over the years. Laughter my name that night at the community center. And recently, it's been more frequent. I thought I was losing it. Then this shows up. Helen studied me for a long moment, searching my face for the smirk of a cruel joke that wasn't there. Finally, she nodded once, as if updating a ledger in her mind. "You think this is what? A message?" She said. "From who?" "Or from what?" I replied. "You remember the meteor shower that night? The one she was so excited about?" Helen let out a bitter, humorless chuckle. "They still run those specials on TV, you know. The Great Leonid Storm of '98. People remember the lights in the sky, not what we lost under them." I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "That night, before I came over, when Molly invited me, something shifted. I can't explain it better than that. And later, at the search center, I heard her. Close, clear, like she was right there and not there at all. I buried that for 27 years, because what cop wants to hear his witness talk about feelings and disembodied voices?" Helen's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. They just made her irises shine brighter. "You're not the only one," she said quietly. "I've heard things too. Doors knocking when there's no one there. Her music box starting on its own. I told myself it was the house settling or my mind trying to keep her alive in some cruel way. You get tired of being the woman with the missing girl. People start looking for madness in your eyes the way they used to look for Molly in every parked car. So I shut up. We sat there, two aging ghosts haunting the same history. For the first time since the early days of the case, I felt less alone with the insanity. "Have you told Charlie?" I asked. She flinched slightly at his name. "We divorced 10 years ago," she said, the words flat from overuse. "He couldn't stay here with all the reminders. I couldn't leave. We talk on holidays. That's about it. If I told him I think our dead or missing daughter is knocking on my bedroom door, he'd sign me up for a very quiet room with padded walls." I nodded slowly. "Then maybe we don't tell him. Not yet. But we can't ignore this." I tapped the photo. "If someone is playing a cruel trick, they've done their research. If it isn't a trick, then something tied to that night is waking up." Helen stared at the picture, and then at me. "You're still a reporter, aren't you?" she said, "even if you don't write for the paper anymore." "I hung up my press badge 5 years back," I said. But the part of my brain that asks, why, apparently forgot to retire. I've got notebooks in my attic older than half the people at the Herald now. "Good," she said, "because I've been waiting 27 years for someone to ask the questions the police stopped asking. If my girl is borrowing time from somewhere to send us this, I'm not going to ignore her." There it was again, that word borrowing. It had slid out of my mouth earlier, and now it was coming from hers, as if our minds were slowly aligning around an idea too big to look at directly. "All right," I said, feeling something click into place inside me, an old engine revving back to life. "We start like we should have started back then, before the press conferences and the speculation and the neighbors with theories. We go back to the last place she was seen, and we look with fresh eyes. And we find out if anyone else got something like this." I held up the photo. "Because if whatever this has reached me, maybe it reached someone else." Helen's gaze drifted to the window, where the slow movement of tree shadows played across the glass. "You think the town is ready to reopen this?" she asked. I thought about the people of Briarwood, the way they still crossed the street a little too quickly near the old bus stop, the way parents clutched their kids' hands tighter at dusk without knowing why. "I don't know if they're ready," I said. But readiness never stopped the truth before. It certainly didn't care about it 27 years ago. Helen stood up suddenly, as if propelled by some internal decision. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared down the hallway. I listened to her footsteps, the creak of a familiar floorboard outside what used to be Molly's room, a drawer opening, the muffled thud of something heavier than a photo album being shifted. When she returned, she carried a small cardboard box, the kind you use for bank statements and tax returns. She set it on the coffee table between us and removed the lid. Inside were fragments of a childhood, a worn-out stuffed rabbit, a friendship bracelet, ticket stubs, school drawings. On top of it all lay a small pink plastic flashlight with faded stickers on the side, stars, comets. "She was supposed to bring this out that night," Helen said, picking it up carefully. "Her cosmic guide," she called it. "The police bagged it as evidence. We got it back when they said there wasn't anything else to test." She flicked the switch on. The beam, weak and flickering, still sputtered to life for a moment before cutting out. "I keep it because I don't know. Because I can't throw away the last thing she held in this house." As the flashlight died, something in the room shifted again. It was subtle, like the faint drop you feel in an elevator just as it starts moving. The overhead light seemed to hum a half-step lower. From somewhere near the hallway, a soft sound tapped once, twice, 3 times, like knuckles on wood. Helen's eyes widened. "Did you?" "Yes," I said, my voice low. "I heard it." We both turned our heads toward the source down the hall, toward Molly's old room. The rational explanation was immediate. House settling, pipes, a branch against the siding. But the knock had an intent in it, a pattern too precise for coincidence. "Helen," I said carefully, "has that been happening often?" She swallowed. "More lately. Always 3 knocks. Once on the bedroom door, once on the closet, once on the window." She laughed weakly. "If it's the wind, it's very well mannered." Every part of my mind that loved evidence and logic and neat case files was screaming at me to get up, open the door, find the loose shutter, the broken latch, the root cause. The other part, the part that had heard his name in an empty parking lot 27 years ago, knew with bone-deep certainty that if I went down that hallway right now, I would find something I wasn't ready to understand. There's a reason most people don't look directly at eclipses. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the same kind I'd carried on crime scenes in my 30s. It was half filled with grocery lists and half forgotten story ideas. New ink bled into old pages as I wrote. 3 knocks. Flashlight. Photo dated day before. Voice at community center. Meteor shower. "I'm going to dig out everything I have," I said. "Old notes, clippings, tapes. Then I'm going to talk to some people I haven't bothered in a long time. The original lead detective, if he's still alive. The volunteers. Anyone who was on Maple Lane that night. But I need you to do something, Helen." She looked up from the flashlight. "Anything," she said. "Write down every incident. I said. Every knock, every sound, every time you thought you saw her out of the corner of your eye. Dates, times, what you were doing. No filtering, no self-editing. Treat it like evidence. Because if this is some kind of pattern, we need the full picture, not just the parts that feel acceptable to admit. Helen nodded slowly, like someone agreeing to open a box they've buried in the yard and hoped would stay sealed. All right, she said. But promise me something, Dan. What's that? That if this goes nowhere, if it turns out to be some sick prank, or my brain finally folding in on itself, you won't let me drag this town through another circus. I can't watch the lights and the cameras and the gawkers all over again. I promise, I said, and meant it. If it's nothing, it dies in my notebook. If it's something, then we decide together how loud to make the noise. As I left the Carter house and stepped back onto Maple Lane, the afternoon light had slid toward evening. Shadows of the maple trees stretched long across the pavement, reaching toward the spot where Molly's bicycle had once lain. For a moment, the wind stilled, and the whole street felt like it was holding its breath. On impulse, I walked to the end of the cul-de-sac, to that exact invisible marker etched into my memory. No skid marks now, no police tape, just a patch of asphalt indistinguishable from the rest. But to me, it might as well have been a crime scene frieze, framed in amber. I stood there, closed my eyes, and let the sounds of the neighborhood wash over me. Distant lawnmower, a dog barking 2 streets over, a screen door slamming. Then, faint and unmistakable, I heard it. The soft tick of a bicycle wheel spinning, slowing, stopping. My eyes flew open. There was no bike, no child, just an empty street and the lonely sway of a street lamp not yet lit. Okay, I murmured under my breath, to the air, to the sky, to whatever had decided to stir. You've got my attention. What I didn't know then was that the town wasn't the only thing waking up. The past has a way of circling back when you tug hard enough on one thread. And as I would soon find out, somewhere far beyond Briarwood, beyond our county, beyond even our atmosphere, patterns were shifting meteors, magnetic fields, strange readings no one wanted to connect to a missing girl from a small American street. But the first real crack in the cold case didn't come from a lab or a telescope. It came from an old cassette tape buried in my attic, its label smudged, its contents forgotten. A tape that shouldn't have recorded what it did at the time it did. That night, as the sky over Briarwood began to clear again, and the first stars blinked awake, I pulled down the attic ladder, grabbed a flashlight of my own, and climbed up into the dust to meet a younger version of myself, and the sound he'd accidentally captured 27 years ago. The attic in my house has a particular kind of silence, the heavy, layered kind that only builds up in places where people store things they don't want to deal with, but can't bring themselves to throw away. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight the same way it had 27 years ago, complaining at the intrusion, and the smell hit me the moment my head cleared the hatch dust. Dry insulation, old paper, and the faint ghost of cedar from a trunk my father once owned. For a moment, I just stood there, half in, half out, my flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark. If you'd told me, back when I first moved into this house, that one day I'd be crawling around up here searching not for Christmas decorations or tax folders, but for proof that time doesn't move in a straight line, I would have laughed and offered you a refill on your drink. I hauled myself all the way up and clicked the hatch closed behind me, sealing in the dimness. The flashlight beam swept across boxes I'd labeled in a younger, neater hand. Herald Archives. Taxes 1990 to 2000. MISC. Notes. A spider, offended by the sudden light, scurried back into the shadow between 2 old suitcases. It occurred to me that if my heart decided to call it quits up here, no one would find me for a couple of days. The thought didn't scare me as much as it probably should have. Growing old with unanswered questions has a way of dulling your fear of where you might fall down. I made my way toward the far corner, where the roof sloped so low I had to stoop. That was where I kept the things that mattered once, and then hurt too much to keep close. A box of clippings from my bigger stories, a framed award from some press association that folded years ago, and if my memory hadn't betrayed me entirely, a cardboard shoebox full of cassettes I'd recorded on an old handheld reporter's recorder. In the late 80s and 90s, that little device had been my constant companion, its tiny spinning reels capturing interviews, notes, and the kind of muttered observations I never intended anyone else to hear. The beam landed on the shoebox, sagging a bit in the middle. Someone more sensible would have digitized these tapes by now, fed them into a computer, and labeled them neatly. Instead, I'd shoved them up here and spent 15 years pretending they didn't exist. My hand hovered over the lid for a second, that same thin ice feeling from Helen's hallway humming at the edges of my awareness. Then I took a breath and opened it. Inside, a dozen or so black plastic cassettes lay jumbled together, their labels in varying stages of decay. Some had neat handwriting. Mayor Interview 1094ths. Court D.O.C. Baxter Case. Others bore only smeared lines where words once were. One tape sat at the bottom, turned at a slight angle, as if it had been tossed in last. Its label, unlike the others, had been written in a hurry, the ink pressed so hard it had indented the paper. Come CTR, the 5th of November 98, search. The date hit me in the chest like a swing of a bat. November 5th, 1998, the night of the search for Molly. Back then, I'd carried the recorder by habit, more out of muscle memory than expectation. I remembered pressing record at the community center once, maybe twice, to capture a few quotes from the sheriff. I did not remember listening to that tape afterward. Maybe I'd been too close. Maybe, for once in my career, I hadn't wanted to hear my own questions. Now, in the dim heat of the attic, the cassette seemed to pulse in my hand, as if holding on to a piece of that night, like a fossil holds a footprint. I slid it into my jacket pocket before I could change my mind. I grabbed 2 more tapes at random, one from 97, one from 99, because even in the middle of chasing ghosts, the journalist in me wanted control samples. Then I climbed back down, each step of the ladder a small act of commitment. Back in the living room, I dug my old tape player out of a drawer I hadn't opened in years. The batteries, by some minor miracle, still had enough life in them to make the little red play light flicker when I tested it with a blank tape. The hiss of empty magnetic tape filled the room, oddly comforting. Analog noise. I'd taken comfort in that sound in long nights at the Herald, when the world made more sense and my body didn't ache getting out of a chair. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the dining table with the tape player in front of me, and laid out the 3 cassettes like I was about to perform some low-rent magic trick. Start with something ordinary, I told myself. Prove the machine still works. Prove your brain isn't building monsters out of static. I picked up the tape from 97 Mayor Interview 397s and clicked it into place. The mayor's voice crackled to life after a few seconds of hiss, thin and reedy through the little speaker. We were discussing a budget shortfall, his frustration at losing funding for after-school programs, the way he tried to turn every answer into an opportunity to mention his re-election. I almost smiled. The past, in that slice of tape, behaved itself. No ghostly whispers, no strange sounds. Just me younger, with a sharper tone in my questions, occasionally audible in the background. After a few minutes, satisfied, I stopped the tape and rewound it. The 99 cassette was much the same, an interview with a gravedigger for a feature I'd done on the town cemetery. His slow, deliberate drawl mingled with the caw of crows in the background, my occasional interjections. Again, nothing out of the ordinary, beyond my own dated turns of phrase. Folks around here, I heard younger me say, Still believe some ground remembers what you put in it. I'd thought that line poetic once. Now it felt prophetic. Finally, I picked up the 5th of November 98 tape. Up close, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the attic. The plastic casing had a faint, almost imperceptible warp along one edge, like it had been left too close to a heat source at some point and then cooled. The screws holding it together were slightly tarnished, but the little clear window still showed the brown tape wound neatly on its reels, waiting. "Okay," I muttered. "Let's see what you've been holding on to." I clicked it in. Pressed play. For a long heartbeat, there was only hiss. Then the background noise of the community center seeped through voices overlapping, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, the occasional clatter of a coffee pot. My own voice cut in, steady, professional. "Sheriff Mills, can you give us an update on the search?" I heard myself ask. The sheriff's reply followed, clipped and careful, full of the usual phrases. Coordinated effort. Every resource available, no stone unturned. I remembered this part, not the exact words, but the tone, the way he'd kept glancing at Helen, who sat on a folding chair nearby, hollow-eyed and gripping a styrofoam cup so hard her knuckles had gone white. This was the sound of a town trying to convince itself it was still in control. I let it play, leaning back, eyes closed, letting the audio paint the room in my mind. Snippets of other interviews drifted by volunteers talking about the search grid, a deputy explaining the role of the K-9 units, the low murmur of someone reciting a prayer with the pastor. Then, about 12 minutes in, my recorded voice said, "I'm going to step outside for a moment," followed by the muffled click of the recorder being jostled, the creak of a door opening, and a rush of night sounds. This was it. The moment I'd gone outside for air, when I would hear whatever I'd heard all those years ago. My grip on the edge of the table tightened. On the tape, the hubbub of the community center faded behind the heavier quiet of the parking lot. Crickets, the distant hum of a generator. Somewhere, a car door slammed, muted my distance. My footsteps crunched on gravel. For a few seconds, nothing else. Then the laughter came. It was faint at first, almost lost in the ambient noise. But as the recorder swung gently on its strap, the microphone seemed to catch it more clearly. A child's giggle. High, bright, utterly wrong in that context. It came once, a quick burst, then again, slightly closer, as if the source had moved. On the tape, younger me went very still. I could hear my own breathing pause. "Hello?" my recorded voice called, wary but still rational. "Hello, Molly?" Listening now, the way my tone changed made my skin prick. You can hear the exact moment concern starts to outrun skepticism. There was a small scuffing sound, like a shoe on concrete. Then, right next to the microphone, so close it made the speaker crackle, a whisper. "Mr. Hayes?" I stopped the tape, and the room dropped into silence, so deep the ticking of the clock felt like gunshots. My own heart hammered in my ears. I'd remembered hearing my name that night, but memory is a treacherous thing. It smears edges, cleans up noise, lays a soundtrack over your worst moments. Hearing it again, unedited by time, was like being yanked backward through my own spine. I rewound a few seconds, pressed play again, forced myself to listen. The giggle, the scuff, the whisper. It was Molly's voice. Not kind of like, not could be. The intonation, the slight lisp on the mister, the way she stretched the A in Hayes, like it was half a question. There are a few sounds a person who's lost a child never forgets. Their laugh, their cry, the way they said certain names. Molly saying my name had always carried a mix of respect and mischief, like she expected me to either solve a mystery or join one. But there was something else on the tape, something I hadn't registered at the time, because I'd been too stunned by the impossible. Underneath her whisper, barely audible, there was a faint crackling hum. Not tape hiss, not wind, a sort of static, but organized, if that makes any sense. Rhythmic, almost. As if another sound, on another frequency, were bleeding through. I leaned closer, brow furrowed, trying to isolate it. The more I focused, the clearer it became. A series of clicks, spaced unevenly, layered under the whisper. 3 quick, 1 slow. Pause. 2 slow. 3 quick. It triggered a memory I couldn't pin down, like a word on the tip of my tongue. I dug in the drawer again until I found an old pair of headphones. The foam on one side slightly crumbled. Plugged them in, hit play, and this time closed my eyes and tuned everything else out. Giggle, scuff, whisper, static. That wasn't static. Clicks, Morse code. I hadn't thought about it in years, not since my father taught me the basics in our garage, tapping out his Navy days on the side of an oil drum. Short, long, short, short. Dots and dashes. I was rusty as hell, but even my decayed recall recognized a pattern where randomness should have lived. I grabbed the notebook that had already begun filling with fresh ink and on instinct, started marking the clicks dot for short, dash for long. Pauses between clusters, slashes. I ran it back twice, 3 times, until I had a shaky transcription. I ran it back. It made no sense as English letters, at least not in any sequence that formed a word I knew. But the fact that it mapped it all was enough to send another cold wave through me. Something had piggybacked her voice. I sat there for a long minute, pen resting against the page, staring at the silly little dots and dashes. At some point, my reflection appeared in the dark TV screen across from me, the lines on my face deeper than they'd been in my memory of myself, eyes a little too wide. If this were a story I was writing about someone else, this would be the part where readers started muttering, "Get out of the house," under their breath. But stories on the page and stories you live by aren't the same animal. On the page, the danger is entertainment. In real life, it just sits with you, heavy and patient. Finally, I picked up the phone. I didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. There was one person who needed to hear that tape before anyone with a badge or a lab coat got involved. It felt cruel, in a way, dragging her ears back through a sound that had haunted mine for decades. But if I kept it to myself, I'd be back where I started, alone with the impossible. Helen answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello? It's me," I said. "I found something." On an old tape. From the night of the search. There was a small, sharp inhale on the other end. "Is it about her?" she asked. "I mean, of course it is. Why else would you call?" "Dan, I don't know how much more I think you need to hear it," I said gently. "But I won't force you." It's her voice, Helen, from outside the community center. And there's something under it. "I can come over now, or come," she said. The word clipped, but steady. "If I say no, I'll hate myself. If I say yes, at least I'll hate you with company." I grabbed the tape player and the notebook, shrugged into my jacket, and headed back out into the early dark. The sun had slipped behind the trees, leaving the sky a deepening wash of blue-gray. Streetlights buzzed to life one by one. As I walked, a kid on a bike zipped past me, headphones in, oblivious. For half a second, the whir of his tires and the squeak of his brakes overlaid perfectly with the memory on the tape. I watched him round the corner and disappear, my chest tight. Helen opened the door before I even finished my second knock. Her face looked more drawn than it had that afternoon, but there was a steel in her eyes that reminded me of the woman who'd once stood in front of a line of microphones and begged America to look for her daughter. "Kitchen," she said. "Tables cleared. I made tea. I thought about whiskey, but if I start that early, I won't hear anything at all." We sat at the small table, the tape player between us like some strange relic from an older, more analog haunting. I set the cassette in place, my fingers deliberately slow, giving her one last chance to back out. She didn't take it. Before I hit play, I said, "You should know, this is going to sound wrong. Familiar and wrong at the same time. If at any point you want me to stop, just say it." "I mean it." She folded her hands together so tightly, her knuckles went pale. "Play it," she said. I pressed the button. The search center noise filled her little kitchen, sounding bizarrely out of place among the humming fridge and the ticking wall clock. Helen's eyes flicked back and forth, as if she could see the room through the audio. The volunteers, the bulletin board, the pastor moving from group to group. Her own voice surfaced once, faint in the background, asking a deputy if they'd checked the drainage ditch by the highway. A muscle jumped in her cheek when she heard it. Then came the transition to outside. The door creak, the air shift. I watched her face as her body recognized the sound of that night in a way memory alone couldn't mimic. She was transported, whether she wanted to be or not. When the giggle came, she gasped, a small wounded sound. Her hand flew to her mouth in a mirror of the earlier reaction to the photograph. "That's her," she whispered through her fingers. That's her laugh. Dan." "I know," I said quietly. "Listen." The scuff, the pause. And then, so close we both involuntarily leaned back a fraction, the whisper, "Mr. Hayes?" Helen's other hand shot out, gripping my forearm with surprising strength. Tears spilled over now, running clean tracks down her cheeks. "She sounds happy," Helen choked. "Like she doesn't know anything's wrong. Like she's about to ask you if you want marshmallows." My own throat tightened. "Yeah," I managed. "Yeah, she does." I let the tape run a few seconds longer into the hiss, and stopped it. We sat with the silence heavy between us, filled with 27 years of what-ifs. "Hear anything under it?" I asked gently. Under her voice? Helen frowned through her tears, blinking as she replayed the memory of the sound in her head. "There was noise," she said slowly. "Not the center. Something. Buzzing or clicking? I thought it was just old tape." "It might be more than that," I said, and turned the notebook around so she could see the dots and dashes. "I think something else was riding along with her voice, like interference. Or a signal." She stared at the scribbles, then back at me. "You're telling me my missing daughter left us a Morse code message in a whisper?" She said, half incredulous, half desperate. "I'm telling you I don't know," I said. "But it lines up enough that I can't ignore it. My dad taught me Morse when I was a kid. I'm rusty, but this," I tapped the page, "isn't random. And if it's not random, someone or something put it there." Helen let out a shaky breath that was almost a laugh. "You always did know how to find the weird angle in a story, Dan. UFOs over Briarwood, psychic cats, now cosmic kidnappers. But this..." She shook her head. "Part of me wants to throw that thing against the wall. The other part wants you to play it 100 times until it makes sense. That's the trap with the unexplained," I said. "It feeds on your need to turn it into a pattern. The more you stare, the more it stares back." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and straightened a little. "So what do we do? Decode it? Call a priest?" "First, I'll run it past someone who still remembers Morse better than I do," I said. "There's an old ham radio guy, lives out near the highway, used to help me with a story on emergency broadcasts. If there's a hidden message in those clicks, he'll find it, and I won't tell him where it came from. Just ask him what he hears." Helen nodded. "Good, and me?" "You keep that box handy," I said, nodding toward the cardboard container of Molly's things in the other room. "If the knocks, the music box, anything if it happens again, you write it down. And if you're up for it, I'd like to see her room. Not tonight, but soon." She hesitated, then gave a short, resolute nod. "Tomorrow," she said. "Come by after lunch. I'll open the door. As I walked home under a sky rapidly filling with stars, tape player tucked under my arm, it struck me that we were moving backward and forward at the same time. Back into old rooms, old evidence, old wounds. Forward into territory no missing persons handbook had ever really mapped. The overlapping of grief and physics, memory and whatever sits just to the left of what we call reality. One part of my brain cataloged tasks called the ham operator, dig through old Herald archives, chart the timeline of knocks and whispers. Another part simply listened to the wind threading through the trees and wondered if, somewhere out there, a little girl in a yellow raincoat was still walking a path between two worlds, looking for a way home. That night, as I lay in bed, the house dark and quiet around me, I heard it again. 3 soft, measured knocks, not on my front door this time, but on the wall, just behind my headboard. 1, 2, 3. Not loud enough to be a prank. Not in the rhythm of an old house settling. Just deliberate. I stared at the ceiling. Every nerve in my body lit up. After a moment, without moving, I said into the dark, "Molly, if that's you, we're listening." I don't know how yet, but we're listening. There was no reply, no spectral whisper, no cold breath on my neck. Just the familiar creaks and sighs of an old home adjusting to the drop in temperature. Eventually, sleep found me in fits, dragging half-formed dreams behind it flashes of starfields, a bicycle wheel spinning in place, and a row of numbers on a screen I couldn't quite read. In the morning, as coffee gurgled in the machine and the first weak light seeped through the blinds, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No name. No greeting. Just a grainy photo of the community center bulletin board from 1998, the one where we'd pinned up maps and routes, and Molly's school picture. In the corner of the image, barely visible, a reflection in the glass caught the shape of a man standing alone outside, holding something up to his ear. Under it, 3 words. You heard it too. The text came from a number that didn't show up in my contacts, just 10 digits and a carrier tag I didn't recognize. For a long moment I stood in my kitchen in my socks, mug halfway to my mouth, staring at the screen while the coffee smell curled around me like some kind of grounding agent. Whoever had sent the message knew 2 things they shouldn't: that I'd been at the community center that night, and that I'd heard something no one ever put in a report. I set the mug down, wiped my fingers on a dish towel out of pure habit, and thumbed the image wider. It was clearly an old photo, probably scanned from a print. The colors were washed out, the fluorescent lighting turning everything a sickly yellow. The bulletin board took up most of the frame, paper edges curling, thumbtacks glinting. At the center, under a handwritten missing sign, was the school portrait we'd all memorized. Molly with her hair in braids, wearing a purple shirt with a tiny embroidered moon in the corner. Around it were maps of the surrounding woods, copies of the flyer we'd stuffed into mailboxes. In the bottom right, the glass covering the board caught a reflection, a man outside, indistinct at first until my eyes adjusted. He stood just beyond the glass doors of the community center, slightly hunched, holding something to his ear. The reflection warped him, but I recognized the outline of the coat, the way his free hand was jammed into his pocket, the tilt of his head as if he were listening harder than he wanted anyone to notice. It was me, 27 years younger, standing in that parking lot with the recorder at my ear, seconds after the whisper on the tape. My stomach dropped in a slow, vertiginous swoop. The image had been taken from inside the community center, toward the board, catching my reflection unintentionally. It meant someone had been there, that night, close enough to see me through the glass and snap a picture. Someone who'd held on to that photo all this time, or someone who'd found it in a box, like I'd found my tape. Either way, they knew. You heard it too, the text said, like an accusation and an invitation in 3 words. I typed back before thinking too hard, fingers moving on muscle memory. Who is this? Sent. The dots danced for a moment, stopped, started again. No reply. I waited, watching the screen the way you watch a door you expect to open. Nothing. I saved the number under the only label that made sense, unknown, board photo, and set the phone down. Already, the day felt like it was being pulled off the tracks I'd tried to set it on. I was supposed to call the ham radio guy, supposed to go to Helen's after lunch, supposed to pretend I still had some kind of plan. Instead, I found myself printing the texted photo out on my ancient inkjet, the machine whining and coughing like it resented being woken from retirement. The printed page came out streaky, but usable. I pinched it by the corners, careful not to smudge the already cheap ink, and steadied it at arm's length. Little details emerged that hadn't been obvious on the phone. On the far left of the bulletin board, someone had pinned a Polaroid of the search volunteers standing in a line, all reflective vests and tired smiles. On the right, a handwritten note in blue marker read, "Check storm drains by ELM Street done." At the bottom edge of the board, half cut off by the photographer's framing, was a strip of paper where someone had written times. 7 o'clock, 8:30, 10:15, and then scribbled them out. I put the photo down next to my notebook and drew a slow breath through my nose. Somewhere between the tape, the knocks, the mailed photograph, and this text, a second timeline was beginning to sketch itself. Not just the official one, with its search grids and press conferences, but a shadow version. Someone else had been watching, listening, collecting. And after staying quiet for nearly 3 decades, they decided now was the moment to tap me on the shoulder. The ham radio operator's name was Walt Jenkins, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a man more rooted in the old ways of listening. He ran antennas out of a shed behind his weather-beaten ranch house, a forest of thin metal and cable that looked, from the highway, like a failed attempt at growing steel trees. In the Herald days, I'd interviewed him for a piece about emergency communication during storms. He'd spent half the time complaining about kids and their satellites, and the other half spelling things in NATO phonetics just to amuse himself. He lived alone, as far as I knew, with a dog that barked at clouds and a refrigerator full of things that could survive a nuclear winter. Calling him felt like the next move on a board, where the rules were only half explained. I dialed his number and listened to the rings count out my doubt. On the 5th, he picked up. "Jenkins," he barked, as if I'd interrupted some crucial transmission from Mars. "Walt, it's Dan Hayes, from the Herald. Formerly. How's the signal up there on the hill?" There was a pause, then a surprised huff. "Hayes? I figured you'd retired to Florida by now, or the cemetery." "I got money on both options. What can I do you for?" "Still in Briarwood," I said, still above ground. "I've got a recording I was hoping you could take a listen to. Old cassette, bad quality, but there's a pattern under the noise I can't quite nail down. Thought of you and your love affair with static." "Flatterer," he said, but there was interest in his tone now. "You bring it out, I'll put it through the rig. Analog like God intended, or something you pulled off your gadget." "Cassette," I said, "from 98. Another pause, shorter this time. "You bringing me something official?" he asked. "Because if the sheriff's going to show up behind you waving his arms, I'd like to put pants on." "Nothing official," I said. "At least not yet." "Consider this." "Personal, personal," he repeated, tasting the word. "All right, Hayes, you got my curiosity, which is rare before noon. Swing by in an hour, and bring coffee. That fancy stuff you city types drink now. My doctor says I should cut back, but he don't got to listen to the weather over Estonia at 3:00 a.m. I promised to bring coffee and hung up, an odd blend of gratitude and dread settling in. There's a particular vulnerability in handing someone a piece of your supernatural paranoia and asking them to reduce it to dots and dashes. If Walt heard nothing, If the message was just my aging ears making patterns where there were none, then maybe all of this bent back toward grief and coincidence. If he confirmed there was something encoded there, then we were in deeper waters than I'd let myself imagine. Before heading out, I grabbed the printed photo the stranger had texted me and slid it into the same envelope as the mailed picture of Molly in the woods. They made for an uncomfortable stacked two pieces of glossy time, pointing at different angles of the same absence. I tucked the envelope under my arm, grabbed the tape player and my keys, and stepped into the day. Walt's place sat a few miles out of town, past the last gas station, and just before the billboards gave up trying to sell anything. The road narrowed, the houses spread out, and the trees took over. His mailbox, a battered thing with peeling numbers and a sticker that said, "Nitrogen monoxide flyers," leaned at an angle that seemed to defy both gravity and postal regulation. The forest of antennas behind his house caught the light like a strange art installation. He met me on the porch, gray beard more unruly than I remembered, flannel shirt buttoned wrong at the top, bare feet in sandals despite the chill. His dog a mutt, with one ear up and one ear down, sniffed my shoes with professional suspicion and then accepted me as part of the furniture. "You look like 5 miles of bad road," Walt said appreciatively. "Come on in." The inside of his house was what you'd expect if you've ever met a man whose hobby is listening to the ionosphere. Radios of various vintages lined the walls, knobs and dials, and glowing little displays in shades of green and amber. A world map covered one wall, pushpins and strings marking places he'd talked to in the middle of the night. The kitchen table had been sacrificed long ago to equipment, leaving a narrow strip where a man could, with dexterity, set down a mug of coffee and a plate if he was careful. "You weren't kidding," he said, eyeing the tape player I set down among his machines. "That's a proper relic." "Where'd you dig that up, Smithsonian?" "Attic," I said. "Like all the best hauntings." He shot me a look. "We doing ghosts or signals today, Hayes?" "Maybe both," I said. "You tell me after you listen." I handed him the cassette. He squinted at the label. "98, he muttered. "Lord, I was still married then. Might have been happier if I'd listened to more static and less to my ex." He chuckled at his own joke, then went to work with the methodical care of a surgeon. Old gear appeared from under the table: a tape deck, a converter box, a set of headphones that put my crumbly pair to shame. He hooked the cassette up to a system that looked like it could talk to submarines, then gestured for me to sit. "You want me to know what I'm listening to?" he asked. "Or you want a blind read?" "Blind," I said, "for now. Just see if you hear anything besides the obvious voices. Underneath, like a pattern." He slid the headphones on, pressed play, and leaned back, eyes half closed. I watched the small movements in his face, the twitch of an eyebrow, the tightening of his mouth as the community center noises filled his ears. After a minute or two, he raised a hand without looking at me, a silent request for patience. When the giggle and whisper section rolled around, I saw it hit him. His eyes snapped open a fraction, then narrowed. He rewound a short span, listened again, then leaned forward, adjusting a dial that brought up the lower frequencies, dampening the upper ones. His fingers danced across switches, isolating bands of sound. The man might make jokes about static, but this was his cathedral, and he knew every inch. After several passes, he stopped the tape entirely, lifted the headphones off, and set them on the table with surprising gentleness. "Well," he said, "that's interesting. What do you hear?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Besides you and the sheriff, and what sounds like half of Briarwood's church ladies." He scratched his beard. "There's interference, but it's not your usual hum. Not 60 cycle from bad wiring, not tape degradation, not radio bleed from a nearby tower. It's tight, clustered. Morse?" I asked. He tilted his head at me. You hear that too? Enough to scribble this, I said, sliding my notebook over. I'm rusty. He glanced at the dots and dashes, lips moving as he silently decoded. You got most of it, he said after a moment. You were rushing. Here, you flipped this one. That's a dash, not a dot, but yeah, it maps. Question is, to what language? Not English? I asked. Not in any way I like, he said. If you take it straight, letter by letter, you get gibberish. Unless kids started naming themselves after license plates. But he tapped the page. Morse ain't just letters. You can map it to numbers, phrases, even coordinates if you're clever or bored. Coordinates, I repeated. The word tasted strange. He shrugged. Could be nothing. Could be some radio operator's idea of a joke bleeding into your mic back in the day. But he leaned back, studying me. This is old tape, Hayes, and that particular pattern, I've seen something close. Not in Morse by itself, but in a set of odd bursts we picked up a few years back during a Leonid shower. Thought it was equipment glitching at the time. The timing. Hell, I'd have to dig. A Leonid shower, I said slowly. Like in November. He snorted. Well, yeah, that's when they are. Bunch of rocks screaming through the sky, lighting up your wife's garden party. You remember that storm in '98? People still talk about it in my circles. Spikes all over the bands. For a few nights, it was like the atmosphere turned into one big antenna. I thought of Molly in her yellow raincoat, of the way she'd said, Perseid, with such pride, even if she'd gotten the wrong meteor. I thought of the streak of light in the mailed photo, the way my skin had prickled when she ran past my maple tree. Borrowed, I'd said. Borrowed by what? Walt, I said. If I told you this tape was recorded the night a little girl disappeared, right under one of those meteor showers, would that make you more or less inclined to chalk this up to bad wiring? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, went to a shelf, and pulled down a battered 3-ring binder bristling with tabbed dividers. He flipped through pages of printed graphs, notes in his cramped handwriting, dates and times circled in red. Finally, he jabbed a finger at one page and turned it so I could see. November 5th, '98, he said. Local time, around 10 p.m. I was out back, listening. Got a burst of signal on a band that should have been dead, way up above the usual chatter. Pattern of short and long, repeating. Not a standard beacon, not commercial. I filed it under weird noise and thought no more of it. Look here. On the page, a series of lines represented signal strength over time, spiking in a pattern that, even to my novice eye, didn't look random. Beneath it, he'd written, possible Morse? Too faint. Leonid interference? Leonids weren't supposed to peak until later that week, he said. But rocks don't read calendars. Point is, that night, the sky was noisier than usual. And you? You're standing in a parking lot with a tape recorder that just happens to pick up this. He tapped the cassette. A rational man would string the 3 facts, out meteor shower, missing child, weird signal, and still not be comfortable tying them together. Correlation, not causation. I'd written that line enough times for stories about panicked parents and urban myths. But sitting there in Walt's radio cave, the words felt thin. Can you clean it up? I asked. The clicks? Make them clearer, maybe isolate them from the rest? Sure, he said. I can run it through filters, boost what you want, kill what you don't. Won't be TV pretty, but it'll give us a better sense of the pattern. Might even be able to slow it down, see if there's structure we're missing. You want a copy when I'm done? CD? File? Wax cylinder? File's fine, I said. And Walt? Yeah? Keep this between us for now, I said. Call it professional paranoia. He raised an eyebrow. You planning on telling me someday why I'm cleaning up alien ghost code from your old police tape? Someday, I said. when I'm sure which part of that sentence is furthest from the truth. He grinned, then sobered. You look tired, Hayes, like the kind of tired that doesn't come from bad mattresses. Whatever you've stepped in here, don't wade in alone. Static can get in your head. On my way back to town, his words rode shotgun with me. Don't wade in alone. I had no intention of it, not anymore. There was Helen, for one. And now, apparently, there was someone with my number, my history, and a camera from 1998. At Helen's house after lunch, the air felt heavier, like the walls themselves were listening for what we brought. She let me in with a tight, brittle smile and led me wordlessly down the hallway. The door to Molly's room, which I hadn't seen open in 2.5 decades, stood ajar. I did a little cleaning, Helen said, hovering at the threshold. Not much. I couldn't bring myself to change it completely, but I dusted. Changed the sheets. It felt wrong, leaving it frozen. I stepped inside, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the softer light. The room was small, painted a gentle pale blue that had faded around the edges where posters once hung. A narrow bed sat against one wall, covered in a quilt patterned with stars and moons. A small desk faced the window, pencils and a chipped mug, a notebook open to a page of half-finished doodles, flowers, rockets, a lopsided cat. Shelves held books with cracked spines, stuffed animals whose fur had gone a little stiff with time. The air was still, but not stale. Helen must have opened the window recently to let in fresh air, a mundane act in a room saturated with the extraordinary. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, catching dust motes that drifted lazily, each one looking for a second, like it might organize itself into meaning if you stared long enough. What do you feel? Helen asked quietly from the doorway, as if volume might disturb something delicate. Like I'm trespassing, I said, because honesty seemed like the only currency worth anything here. And like I've been here more recently than 27 years. I moved slowly, careful not to touch anything without conscious intent. There's an instinct in the curious to start flipping through drawers, lifting up objects, looking for clues. Every detective movie teaches you that stories hide in the things we leave behind. But this wasn't fiction, and this wasn't my child. I let my eyes do most of the work. On the nightstand beside the bed sat a small plastic alarm clock with a cracked corner, frozen at 6:18. I wondered if the batteries had died that day, and no one had ever replaced them, or if Helen had set it that way on purpose, as a marker in time. Next to it lay a book about space, edges worn soft from rereading. A yellow sticky note poked out, marking a chapter on meteor showers. At the desk, I glanced down at the open notebook. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's, letters uneven, lines drifting upward as if hope alone held them to the page. In the top margin, she'd written, in purple pen, "Things I want to see." Under it, a short list. 1. Real meteor shower. 2. A whale. 3. The Grand Canyon. 4. The other side of the clouds. I felt something twist in my chest. The other side of the clouds. She'd written that like a fanciful, impossible place. And yet if you stand on the right hill, at the right time, it's just air and light. How many impossible places are like that? I wondered only impossible until someone shows you the angle. On the wall facing the bed was a poster of the solar system. Cartoonish planets with big eyes and smiles, Pluto still included. Around it, in little clusters, were glow-in-the-dark stars, some missing where time and gravity had peeled them away. In the faint daylight, they were just pale plastic. At night, decades ago, they would have formed their own private sky. "Nothing's moved much," Helen said behind me. "The police did their sweep back then, took some things, brought some back. After that, I left it. Sometimes I'd come in here and sit on the floor. Sometimes I wouldn't open the door for months. Depends on what kind of day the world was having. Do you ever feel her in here more than in the rest of the house?" I asked. It was a bold question, but subtlety felt like another kind of lie. Helen thought about it, arms wrapping around herself. Sometimes, she said, when I wake up from certain dreams, when the knocks happen, once, years ago, I swear I smelled her shampoo. Stupid thing to fixate on, I know, but kids smell like specific brands and dirt. That strawberry stuff. It was strong. Then it was gone. She hesitated. Why? Do you? I opened my mouth to say, I don't know, and stopped. A faint sensation tingled along the back of my neck, the same way it had by my maple tree the night she invited me over. Not a chill, exactly. More like the air itself was paying attention. I feel expectation, I said slowly, like a room waiting for a story to finish. My gaze drifted to the window. It faced the backyard, the line of trees beyond, and, if you craned your neck just right, a patch of sky where stars would have been clearly visible on a good night. I stepped closer, looking out. Nothing unusual. A bird on a fence, a neighbor's shed, a rake leaning where someone had left it. But at the edge of the glass, near the frame, a small smudge caught my eye. It was a faint arc, like someone with small fingers had pressed in there and dragged, once leaving the ghost of their touch. I pointed. Has that always been there? Helen squinted, stepping up beside me. Our shoulders almost touched. I clean the windows, she said. Well, I think I do, but... She reached out and ran her thumb over the mark. It didn't smear. It's inside the glass, she said softly. Or between the panes. How does that even... A sound cut her off. 3 soft knocks from behind us, in the hallway. Not loud, but clear. 1, 2, 3. We both turned in unison, hearts already racing ahead of logic. The knock hadn't come from the bedroom door. There was no one in the hall, no neighbors dropping by, no wily branch hitting the siding. It had come from the opposite wall, the one that backed onto the small linen closet, and beyond that, the bathroom. A hollow, interior sound, like knuckles on drywall. Stay here, I said, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. Please. I stepped into the hallway, every nerve ending vibrating. The house went very quiet. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to lower itself out of respect. I placed my palm flat against the wall where the sound had come from. The drywall felt cool, unremarkable. I knocked once. Solid. Knocked again, in the same pattern I'd heard 3, spaced like heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. I pressed my ear against the wall and listened. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint and far away, as if traveling a long distance through something thicker than air, I heard it, the answering tap. 1, 2, 3. I stepped back, heart hammering so hard I felt it in my throat. Helen, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Come here. Tell me if I'm losing my mind. She came, slowly, like a person forced to approach a wild animal they weren't sure would bite. I guided her hand to the section of wall, then knocked again. 1, 2, 3. We both held our breath. The reply came softer this time, but undeniably there. 1, 2, 3. Helen's eyes flooded. That's her, she said, not because the sound carried her daughter's voice, but because belief sometimes moves faster than evidence. She used to knock like that on the bathroom door when Charlie was taking too long in the shower. 3 taps. Always 3. A rational explanation scrambled for purchase in my mind. Pipes. House settling. Some fluke of acoustics. But the timing, the repetition, the way it had responded to my knock instead of preceding it, that was harder to dismiss. I pressed the side of my head to the wall again, more gently this time, as if pressing too hard might break whatever tenuous connection existed. My voice, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone a little braver than I felt. Molly, I said quietly, feeling slightly ridiculous and entirely sincere. If you can hear us, if you're the one knocking, we're trying to understand. We're trying to find you. Can you give us something? Anything. A sign that isn't just in our heads? For a long moment, there was only the faint rush of blood in my own ears. Then the wall against my cheek vibrated with a very soft, very rapid series of taps. A flurry, like tiny fingers drumming as fast as they could. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. Helen's hand shot to her mouth again. But this time there was something fierce in her eyes under the fear. "She's impatient," she said with a wet laugh. That's exactly what she'd do when she wanted us to hurry up. Don, I stepped back, swayed a little, steadied myself with a hand on the doorframe. My notebook felt heavy in my pocket. I didn't pull it out right then. Some moments need to live without being immediately dissected. Eventually, the house settled around us again. The fridge resumed its normal hum. Far away, a car door slammed. The spell, if that's what it was, loosened its grip enough for us to breathe more evenly. "Okay," I said finally. "Okay, we have the tape. We have the photograph. We have knocks that answer and walls that drum. We have a ham operator picking up ghost Morse during a meteor shower. And now we have this." I gestured helplessly at the wall. "If this is a cruel joke, it's the most elaborate one I've ever seen. If it isn't, then it's not just a missing persons case anymore. It's something else layered over it." Helen nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the section of wall. "Borrowed," she said, echoing the word I'd used days before. "You said you thought something borrowed her. You think it's trying to return the loan?" "I think," I said, "that whatever happened that night involved more than just one bad human decision. And if that's true, then the usual tools, warrants, interviews, plea deals aren't going to be enough. We need new tools." As if to punctuate the sentence, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped like a guilty teenager, then fumbled it out. Another text from the unknown number. "Nice knock," it read. Below that, a second message arrived before I could respond. "Check under the floorboard. Third from the wall, by the bed." I read it twice, then showed it to Helen. Her face went pale. "Who is this?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said. "But they're either in this house, watching us, or they know it better than we do." We turned, almost in unison, back toward the bedroom. The wooden floorboards between the bed and the wall were old but well kept, their varnish worn in the paths a child would have walked getting in and out of bed. I counted from the wall silently, fingers hovering over each board. 1, 2, 3. The third board I touched had the slightest give to it. Not enough to be obvious, not enough that a casual vacuuming would reveal it, but enough that an old reporter's instincts and an anonymous tip couldn't easily ignore. Helen knelt beside me, hands clenched. "We had the whole house searched," she said, a tremor in her voice. "They had dogs. They looked everywhere. They looked for a missing girl," I said softly. "They weren't looking for this." I slipped my fingernails along the edge of the board, feeling for any gap. There was none. No convenient notch, no easy way to lift it. Whoever had laid this floor hadn't intended for it to be tampered with. I looked around, spotted a thin butter knife on the dresser, and fetched it, ignoring the part of my brain that listed all the crime scene contamination rules I was breaking. We were decades too late for that. Working the blade carefully into the minuscule space between the third board and its neighbor, I pried up, gently but firmly. The wood resisted, then, with a soft creak, yielded a fraction of an inch. Enough to get more leverage. I slid my fingers under and lifted. The board came up, revealing a narrow, dark gap. The smell that rushed out wasn't the putrid reek a crime reporter dreads. It was dry dust, old wood, the faint ghost of something once floral. Nestled in the shallow space wrapped in what looked like a scrap of an old pillowcase, was a small object about the size of a bar of soap. Helen made a strangled sound. "Oh, God," she said. "Oh, God, if that's... It's too small," I said quickly, gently. "And too neat. Bones don't smell like that after 27 years. This is something else." With hands that shook only a little, I lifted the bundle out and unwrapped it. Inside lay a small, familiar shape, a plastic cassette tape. The label, written in careful child's print with a purple pen, read, "For later." My breath left me in a rush. Another tape. Another voice in a box of time. And somewhere in the wiring of the world, I had the sudden, vivid sense that whatever had borrowed Molly Carter was finally, after nearly 3 decades, starting to pay its debt with interest. Helen stared at the little cassette as if it were a live grenade. Her hand hovered over the table, fingers splayed, not quite daring to touch it. I'd seen that look before on parents at crime scenes, when an officer held up a shoe, a backpack, a scrap of fabric, anything that had outlived the child it belonged to. The object became a hostage, a demand, a promise, all at once. "I don't remember this," she whispered. I remember the recorder Charlie bought her one of those little toy tape players with the microphone. She used to sing into it, make up stories. But I don't remember putting anything under the floor. "Kids hide things," I said softly. "Secret diaries, candy wrappers, notes they don't want parents to see. But they don't usually label them for later and bury them under boards unless they think later means something important." Helen swallowed, throat working. "What if it's her voice?" She said, "From that day, what if she knew something was wrong?" There were 1,000 ways this could end badly. The tape might be blank. It might be full of some innocent childhood song that would rip open wounds without offering a single answer. Or it might hold something that would drag this story fully out of the realm of the explainable. My hands weren't as steady as I wanted them to be as I slid the tape into my jacket pocket. "We shouldn't play it on some half-dead toy player," I said. "Let me take it, clean the heads on my machine, run it gently. Old cassette like this. We might only get one good pass before it starts to degrade. You can be there. I won't listen without you." Helen hesitated, and I could see the battle play out behind her eyes. Maternal possessiveness versus practical trust. Finally, she nodded once, sharply. "All right," she said. "But it doesn't leave your sight. Or mine. If that number," she jabbed a finger toward my phone on the dresser, "knows about floorboards, I don't want to give them a head start on what's on that tape." "Agreed," I said. "We'll go to my place now. I've got the player set up, and Walt working on the other recording. One step at a time." As we left the bedroom, Helen paused and looked back. The lifted floorboard lay aside, the cavity now an open mouth in the room's otherwise neat order. She shivered. "Leave it up," she said, "for now. If anyone's watching us, and I'm starting to think someone is, I want them to see we found something." On the drive to my house, Helen sat in the passenger seat with the tape cupped in both hands, as if body heat could protect 27-year-old magnetic particles from snapping. Outside, Briarwood went about its business kids on bikes, a mail truck making its rounds, a teenager leaning against a gas station wall, eyes glued to his phone. The normalcy felt almost indecent, like jaunty music playing over a funeral. "You know what bothers me the most?" Helen said suddenly, gaze fixed out the window. "Not the knocks, not the pictures. It's that text. You heard it too. The idea that all these years, someone else has been sitting with this, knowing, and they said nothing. Let us drown alone. Fear does strange things," I said. "So does guilt. Maybe whoever it is thought they'd be laughed at. Maybe they didn't connect the dots until now. Or maybe," I hesitated, "maybe they're part of why this isn't over. I don't know. But if they're reaching out, it means they want something." Attention, absolution, help. We'll find out. You really think this is more than a man with a sick sense of humor? She asked. I thought of the Morse on the tape, the meteor data in Walt's binder, the knocks answering in a dead girl's pattern. I think if it is just a man with a sick sense of humor, I said, he's about to be very disappointed, because we're not going to play his game quietly. Back at my house, the living room looked suddenly inadequate, like a stage too small for the play about to unfold. I cleared the dining table again, set the tape player in the center, and pulled the curtains just enough to keep the afternoon glare off the dials. Helen sat across from me, the tape between us. You ready? I asked. No, she said honestly. But do it anyway. I ejected the old Search Night cassette with a soft click and slid Molly's tape, for later, into the slot. The plastic felt fragile, as if time had made it brittle. I took a breath I hoped was steadier than it felt, then pressed play. For a moment, there was only hiss. Then a small, high voice came through, and Helen's hand flew to her mouth again. Testing, testing, Molly said, giggling nervously. If you can hear this, that means I did it right. Mr. Hayes says you gotta say who, what, where, when, why. So, who is me? Molly, where is my room? When is, There was a rustle, as if she were checking something. Thursday, November 5th, 1998, after dinner. Before the stars. Helen made a choked sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, but she didn't look away from the little machine. Molly continued, voice dropping a little like she was sharing a secret. Mom is in the kitchen. Dad is at work, but he promised he'd try to get home before the meteors. The newsman said there might be a storm. Not thunder, a starstorm. Mr. Hayes says it's called a Leonid, and that they come from space dust. I think that's funny. Space is dirty. She giggled again, delighted with her own observation. I glanced at Helen. Her lips trembled into the ghost of a smile. She mouthed. She hated dusting. On the tape, something thunked a door. Maybe, and Molly's voice moved closer to the mic. Okay, this is for later. For if I don't get to finish watching, or if something weird happens and everybody forgets, I don't want them to forget. So I'm gonna tell it first. A chill traced the length of my spine. Kids talk big about adventure and disaster all the time. But there was an odd precision in the way she said, if something weird happens and everybody forgets, that set my teeth on edge. It echoed something I'd heard in grown men's voices in war stories, not in the mouth of an 8-year-old. I had a dream last night, she went on. Not like a regular dream. It was like the kind where you wake up and your pillow is wet, and you know you are crying, but you don't remember why. Except I do remember. There was a noise in the sky, like static on Dad's radio when he turns the knob too fast. And there were lights, but not like planes. They blurred. And something was calling, not with words. It was like when you see your name in a crowd before you hear it. You just know. Helen and I exchanged a look. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had crept an inch closer when we weren't paying attention. I got up and looked out the window, Molly said. I thought maybe it was just the garbage truck or Mrs. Keller's TV again. But the stars were wrong. I know where the Big Dipper is, 'cause Grandpa showed me, and it wasn't there. It was like somebody had moved it. And then there was a light over the trees, and it blinked 3 times. Like this. On the tape, there was a pause, then 3 soft taps her hand on the desk or the wall, mimicking the pattern. 1, 2, 3. My heart clenched. The same knock, the same count. 27 years ago, in a little girl's room, recorded for later. I wasn't scared, she said quickly, defensive even in retrospect. Okay, I was a little scared, but it also felt like when you're at the top of the roller coaster and you're about to go down. I could hear, not voices exactly, more like Like when you listen to a seashell and people tell you it's the ocean, but you know it's just air. Except this time, it really was something. It said my name without sound. Molly. Like that. In my head, Helen's hand grabbed the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went bone. White. She never told me this, she whispered. She never said a word about a dream. About anything. Maybe she tried, I said quietly. Kids pick their audience. Maybe she thought you'd worry. Or maybe she didn't have the words. So she did what she could. She recorded it. On the tape, there was the squeak of bed springs. I told Jane, Molly said. I whispered to her in the dark. I said, if I disappear, don't let them forget. She wagged her tail. She's a good dog, but she can't talk, so I decided to do this. Mr. Hayes says records are important. That's why he writes everything down. So I'm writing with my voice. If she'd been alive to grow up, she might have made a damn good reporter. I don't know what the light is, she continued, but I think it's going to come back tonight. It feels like when you know a storm is coming, even if the sky is blue. My skin feels buzzy, like when you lick a battery. Mom says not to do that, but I wanted to know. Anyway, if I'm wrong, then when I listen to this tomorrow, I'll feel silly and I'll erase it. But if I'm right, and something happens, and people say, I just ran away or got lost, I want them to know there was something in the sky. And it knew my name. The tape hissed a little louder for a second, and I realized my own breathing had grown shallow, synced unconsciously to the rhythm of her voice. I hid this under the floor, she said, and there was a faint scraping sound as if she were moving the board. Because I saw a movie where the monster found the tape when it was just in a drawer. Monsters look in drawers. They don't look in floors. That's what Dad says about court stuff, too. People look in the wrong place. So, this is the right place. For later, she paused, and for a moment, there was nothing but the faint rustle of fabric and distant, muffled sounds from elsewhere, the housepots in the kitchen, a TV murmuring in another room. Then softer, almost shy. If you're listening to this, it means later happened. I hope it's Mom, or Dad, or Mr. Hayes. But if it's someone else, hi, please don't be mean to them. They did their best. Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to see stuff that's not on TV. Helen let out a strangled laugh-sob hybrid that broke my heart a little. Okay, I think that's all, Molly said. Oh, one more thing. When the light blinked, I heard, like beeps. Not from the house, from up. I don't know what they mean, but I tried to copy them. Maybe somebody who likes puzzles can figure it out. It went like... She tapped again, but this time the pattern was longer, more complex short taps and long drags, uneven but deliberate. I recognized it instantly as the same strange cluster Walt and I had squinted at in Morse form. It wasn't perfect, no 8-year-old is a metronome, but it was close enough that my blood ran cold. There, she said, a little breathless as if she'd concentrated hard. If you can hear that, you're probably smart. Or you have a good radio. Maybe both. Tell Mom I love her. Tell Dad not to be sad. And tell Mr. Hayes. She hesitated, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. Tell him he was right. Stories matter. Even the weird ones. There was a soft click, and then only hiss. She'd stopped the tape herself. No abrupt cut, no sudden interference. Just an 8-year-old girl, alone in her room on a Thursday evening, doing the best she could to send a message into a future she clearly, on some level, expected might not include her.
I realized my hands were clenched so tightly my nails had left crescents in my palms. I released them slowly, flexing my fingers. Across from me, Helen sat utterly still, tears tracking down but expression oddly calm, like something inside her had finally clicked into an alignment it had been straining toward for years. She was always strange, Helen said after a long moment, voice low and distant, as if she were speaking from the end of a tunnel. not in a bad way, in a tuned-in way. She'd say things before we thought them. She'd wake up the night before my father called from the hospital. Little things you write off as coincidence because the alternative is too much. We prayed for her to be special. I just didn't think. This. Intuition, I said. Call it that, or something more. Whatever it was, it put her in the path of something the rest of us couldn't see or refused to. And now, 27 years later, we're finally catching up. Helen looked up at me, eyes red but steady. So what now, Mr. Reporter? She asked. The old nickname, used half-teasingly back when we were younger, had a different weight now. You've got your tape, your signals, your unexplained phenomena. How do we fight something that might not even live in our kind of time? I thought of Walt with his antennas pointed at the sky, of the anonymous texter with old photos and new technology, of the knocks in the wall and the girl who'd learned to knock back. I thought of all the true crime stories I'd written that ended with handcuffs, verdicts, closure measured in sentences. This case wouldn't fit on that shelf. We do what we've always done, I said slowly. We look, we listen, we put everything on the board, human and not. If there was a man involved that night, we find him. If there was something else, we figure out where it touched our world and how. Maybe Walt can map those beeps, see if they match any known signal patterns, or if they're something new. Maybe that anonymous texter finally steps out of the shadows. Maybe the sky over Briarwood has one more secret to show us. Helen wiped her face with a napkin and, to my surprise, managed a crooked, almost fierce smile. And in the meantime, I said, we don't pretend this didn't happen. You talk to her when you hear the knocks. I'll keep pushing on the old files. And when Walt calls with whatever he finds in that code, you and I will be the first to hear it. As if summoned by the thought, my phone buzzed on the table. A message from Walt this time. Short, but enough to send another small shock through my nervous system. Ran your pattern, it read. Not English, not numbers. Looks a hell of a lot like coordinates. You might want to look up literally. Under it, he'd attached a screenshot. A crude map projection with a set of latitude and longitude numbers highlighted, along with a notation. Approx. Point above Earth where Leonid Stream intersected magnetosphere 11598 Briarwood overhead. Molly hadn't just heard something that night. She'd recorded, in the clumsy taps of a child on a wooden desk, a rough translation of where the sky itself had opened above our town. Later, people would argue about what it meant. Scientists, if we ever brought them in, would talk about coincidence, about pareidolia, about the human hunger for patterns. Preachers would talk about signs and tests. Conspiracy theorists would have a field day, drawing lines between meteor showers and missing children and government cover-ups. But in that quiet room, with Helen across from me and a little plastic cassette still warm from the player, it meant one simple, terrifying, exhilarating thing. The cold case of a missing child had just become a conversation with the past, with the sky, and with something that might finally be ready to answer why an 8-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat had been borrowed from Maple Lane on a clear November night. If there's one thing the universe is good at, it's timing. It rarely lines up the way we want when we want, but every once in a while you feel all the invisible gears click at once. Sitting there with Helen, Walt's message still bright on my screen, a cassette labeled for later cooling between us, I had the bone-deep sense that whatever was behind Molly's disappearance had decided later was now. I turned the phone so Helen could see the map Walt had sent. To her credit, she didn't flinch at the jargon or the jagged lines. She went straight to the only part that mattered. Above our house, she said. Above our street. That's what that means. Above all of us, I said. That night, the stream of meteors, that river of space dust passed over Briarwood. Walt says the pattern in the beeps is close to a point where that stream intersected Earth's magnetic field. Think of it like a crossing, a spot where whatever's out there had an easier time brushing against whatever's in here. Like thin ice, she murmured, or a loose board in the floor. Exactly, I said, and Molly. She didn't just feel it, she heard it, enough to tap it out, enough to hide it. Helen leaned back, exhaling slowly, the weight of the last hour pressing down. I used to pray, she said quietly, that there was a man, that someone had grabbed her, as horrible as that sounds, because the alternative that my little girl just vanished was worse. At least a man you can hate, you can hunt, You can stare down in a courtroom and dare him to look away first. But how do you hate a crossing, a magnetic field, a patch of sky? You don't, I said. You don't have to pick. We chased men back then, neighbors, strangers, anyone whose story didn't line up perfectly. We might have missed more than we thought, but not everything human was asleep that night. There could still be a man in this somewhere, a driver who saw something, someone who went into those woods, for reasons that had nothing to do with the sky. But if we only look at the ground, we'll miss half the picture. She studied me for a long moment. You sound like you did in your old columns, she said. The ones that got you angry letters and cookies in the same week. Occupational hazard, I said. You piss off enough people, they either bake for you or try to run you over. Both are forms of affection. A small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She was right, you know, she said. Tell Mr. Hayes he was right. Stories matter. She always liked when you came over with your notebook. Said you asked better questions than the grown-ups at church. High bar, I said, but I'll take it. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. For a second my pulse jumped, but it was just Walt following up. You owe me that fancy coffee twice over, his text said. And Hayes. Whatever you're in, don't let the Sky folks get all the credit. People do plenty of damage on their own. He wasn't wrong. And there was one person I'd been circling around in my thoughts since the first knock on my door that started all this. Charlie Carter. I need to talk to your ex-husband, I said. Helen stiffened. He'll tell you the same things he told the police, she said. He was at work. There were time cards, colleagues, camera footage at the courthouse. They tore his alibi apart and put it back together 10 different ways. We almost lost him twice to suspicion and to his own darkness. I don't know if dragging him back is. I'm not looking to accuse him, I said, but he's the last piece of the immediate circle. You had your experiences. I had mine. Walt had his signals. If anyone else that close to Molly felt or saw something strange, even if they buried it under paperwork and logic, we need to know. This isn't about relitigating his innocence. It's about widening the lens. She considered that, fingers drumming lightly on the table in a rhythm that, I noticed, carefully avoided 3 evenly spaced taps. He lives in Columbus now, she said at last. Second marriage, 2 boys, sales job. He calls on holidays, birthdays, sometimes on the anniversary. Drunk, usually. I don't know if he can handle this. Maybe he can't, I said. But if he's been carrying any piece of this alone the way we have, giving him a seat at the table might be kinder than leaving him out in the dark. Helen sighed, long and tired. I'll text him, she said. If I call, he'll hear too much in my voice. But if I say you want to talk, he still respects you, even after everything. Maybe that's enough bait. She pulled her phone out and typed, thumbs hesitant but determined. After a moment, she slid the screen to me. The message was simple. Dan Hayes is looking into some old notes from '98. Says it might help him finally write something that makes sense of that night. Would you talk to him? She added, after a beat, he found something of Molly's. I'll take responsibility for that last line, I said. If he yells, he can yell at me. While we waited, I made copies of Molly's tape, one for safekeeping, one to give to Walt for analysis. I did it carefully, feeding the sound into my aging laptop, watching the waveforms draw across the screen like a digital heartbeat from another era. I labeled the file with more reverence than I'd given some of my published articles. M. Carter for later 110598 WAV. Helen watched the process with the wary curiosity of someone seeing an autopsy of memory. It's strange, she said softly, hearing her voice on a screen. We never had that. No home movies, just pictures. For years, I'd lie awake trying to remember how she said, Mom, you think you'll never forget, but your brain doesn't cooperate. Now, there she is, in little lines. Lines are what we get, I said. Text, tape, waves. We're lucky when they line up enough to tell us anything. Her phone buzzed. We both jolted. She read the reply, jaw tightening, then handed it to me. Tell him I'll talk, Charlie's message read. But not on the phone. I'll drive down this weekend, if there's really something of hers. I need to see it, weekend, I said. That gives us 3 days. 3 days for what? Helen asked. To decide how much of the impossible we're going to unload on him at once, I said, and to see what else shakes loose now that we've started tugging on the past. As it turned out, we didn't have to wait 3 days for the next piece to surface. That evening, just as the sun was pulling away from Briarwood and the sky was catching fire in oranges and purples, my landline rang. Not the cell. The old phone on the wall with a cord long enough to wrap around a room if you felt like pacing. Hardly anyone called that number anymore. When they did, it was usually a telemarketer who still thought, "Mr. Hayes, we'd like to talk to you about your car's extended warranty would work on a man whose car predates some of their interns." "Yeah," I said, guarding my tone out of old habit. "Mr. Hayes." The voice was male, mid-40s maybe, though phones can lie. There was a tightness around the words, like each one cost him. "You don't know me, but I think I'm the one who sent you that photo. And I think I made a mistake 27 years ago." Every muscle in my body went still. I stepped into the hallway, away from the TV and the outside noise, cord stretching taut. "All right," I said carefully. "Who am I talking to?" There was a rustle on the line, a muted cough, then, "Name's Eric Lawson. I used to work for the sheriff's office. Auxiliary, volunteer. I was at the community center the night that girl went missing. Molly, I've heard your name more times than I can count, but we've never talked." I racked my memory, running through the lineups of uniforms and vests from that week. Eric's name floated just under the surface of recall, attached not to a face but to a box on an old roster sheet. "Okay, Mr. Lawson," I said. "You have my attention. You sent the photo of the board with my reflection in it." "Yeah," he said. "Found it when my mom passed box of old pictures from her camera. She always took photos at church events, town things. She was there that night, bringing sandwiches, snapped a shot of the board. When I saw you in the glass with that recorder to your ear, I remembered. And when the news ran that anniversary piece last month, talking about the case going cold, something in my head cracked a little." He took a shaky breath. "I heard it too. Not the Morse. I don't know Morse, but the voice in the parking lot. I was coming around the side with a box, going to my car, and I heard a girl giggle, say, 'Mr. Hayes.' I looked, and there was nobody. You were standing there alone, looking like someone had just slapped you with a ghost. I thought about saying something, but we were tired, and the sheriff was already looking at me funny for talking about the weird radio interference earlier. So I kept my mouth shut. I told myself it was stress, that if there was something to it, the Lord would make it clear. Then life happened, kids, jobs, and that little voice in my memory just sat there, until I saw that picture, until I realized you hadn't forgotten either. It took me a moment to find my own voice, the confirmation that someone else, entirely independently, had heard the same impossible sound at the same impossible moment, hit like a second, delayed wave. "Why text me instead of calling?" I asked. "Why now?" "Because I'm a coward," he said without flinching from it. "And because writing 'you heard it too' felt easier than saying it out loud, as for now. My therapist would say it's because my mom died and my mortality's staring me in the face. I'd say it's because I started having that dream again." I closed my eyes. "What dream, Mr. Lawson?" He laughed once, harsh and humorless. "You'll think I'm crazy." "Sir," I said, "I just spent my afternoon listening to a dead girl narrate a meteor forecast from 27 years ago. Crazy is relative. Go on." "It's always the same," he said, voice dropping. "I'm standing in the community center, but the lights are off. The bulletin board is glowing, like it's made of its own light. There's a door where the picture of the girl should be. Not a real door, just outlined, and something's knocking from the other side, 3 times. I want to open it, but every time I reach for it, I wake up with my hand asleep and pins and needles up my arm. I used to get that dream once a year, around November. Lately, it's every night. Figured it was God's way of telling me I'd let something stay shut too long." "What do you think is on the other side of that door?" I asked. Silence crackled down the line, thick and uneasy. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think it's just that girl. I think there's more than one voice, like the receivers stuck on a station between worlds. I run a radio in my truck sometimes. I know what crosstalk sounds like. This isn't clean." The image made something in my chest go cold. "Eric," I said, "do you remember hearing anything else weird that night? Before or after the voice? Any strange noises on the walkie, odd light in the sky, anything unusual on the radios?" He hesitated. "I remember my handheld freaked out once," he said. Screen blinked, battery meter jumped, loud squawk of static that made me rip the earpiece out. Sheriff yelled at us to keep the channels clear. I wrote it down in my incident notes with a little circle and a question mark. Those notes went into a file cabinet. I moved on. But if someone with better ears than mine says there was a pattern in that noise, I believe them. I sank down onto the hall bench, phone pressed tight. There was a pattern, I said, and Molly heard it too. She tapped it out on a tape she hid under her floor. We just found it today. He exhaled, a shaky, almost relieved sound. Then I'm not crazy, he said. Or at least I'm not crazy, alone.
Far from it, I said. Listen, Eric. I'm meeting with Molly's parents. I've got an old radio man decoding signals. We're not law enforcement, but we're listening with new ears. Would you be willing to come by the house? Talk in person? Maybe bring any notes or records you still have. If you're ready to open that door in your dream a little. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear faint TV noise in the background on his end. A woman's voice. A commercial jingle. Normal life wrapping itself around something decidedly not normal. At last he said, Yeah, I think I need to. If my wife asks, I'll tell her it's a church thing. In a way, that's not a lie. Text me an address and Mr. Hayes? Yeah. If this turns out to be just trauma and static and coincidence, that's fine. I can live with that. But if it's more, don't let them sweep it under the rug this time. People like simple answers. Missing kids make them itch. Complex answers make them angry. They'll call you names. They'll call me worse. Don't stop. I've been called worse by better people, I said. We'll keep going. After I hung up, I stood in the dim hall for a minute, listening to the faint hum of my house, the world outside, my own blood. The case that had defined the worst year of my career was no longer just a file in a cabinet. It was a living thing with new branches, new voices, new coordinates. Whatever had reached down over Briarwood that November night, whatever had whispered a little girl's name in a parking lot and drummed its code into the walls of her home, was still reaching, still knocking. The question wasn't whether we'd open the door. The question was what, exactly, was waiting on the other side when we finally did. By the time Saturday rolled around, Briarwood felt like it was holding its breath again. The forecast said clear skies, cold but calm, the kind of November day that tricks you into thinking winter might stay polite this year. I woke up before my alarm, not because I'm one of those sunrise people, but because my dreams had done a poor impression of sleep. Meteors streaking silently overhead, floorboards knocking in empty rooms, maps unfolding into star charts. Somewhere in the middle of it, Molly's voice had threaded through, for later, and refused to let go. I spent the morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I turned my living room into a war room. Old instincts took over. I cleared the walls, taped up butcher paper, spread out printed photos, the mailed image of Molly in the woods, the texted shot of the bulletin board, Walt's coordinate map with the Leonid stream scribbled across it. Newspaper clippings from '98 yellowed at the edges, went up in a rough timeline. Picture of the Carter house. A copy of Molly's school portrait, scanned and printed from the original in the Herald archives. I drew lines and circles, arrows connecting events that had once felt isolated and now hummed with resonance. The meteor storm, the power flickers reported that night, the dogs losing the scent at the edge of the woods, Walt's weird burst on his radio, the tape from the community center, Molly's hidden cassette, the knocks. It looked like every cliché of every obsessed detective you've ever seen on television. If some stranger walked in, they'd either call the sheriff or a therapist. But to me, it felt like respect. For years, Molly's case had lived as a stack of folders in a government cabinet. Now it had a room again. Helen arrived first, just after noon, carrying a Tupperware container like a talisman. "I bake when I'm nervous," she said, by way of greeting. "They're chocolate chip." I figured if the universe is going to start explaining itself, it can at least have a cookie. She stepped into the living room and stopped dead, eyes tracking the mess on the walls. For a second, a flicker of something passed over her face. Grief. Yes, but also a kind of grim satisfaction. You always did like your visual aids, she murmured. Charlie used to say your living room looked like a crime show waiting for its close-up. He wasn't wrong, I said. Help yourself to the red string if you want to complete the stereotype. She set the cookies on the coffee table and moved slowly along the wall, fingertips hovering near photos without quite touching them. When she reached the mailed picture of Molly on the trail, she laid her hand flat beside it, palm on paper, as if expecting to feel a pulse. She looks so alive, she whispered. I know that sounds obvious, but some photos, even from before, you can tell in hindsight. There's a shadow. This one, it's like the world hadn't decided what to do with her yet. Maybe it still hasn't, I said. Walt showed up next, in a sweater that had seen better decades and a pair of boots that looked like they'd been through 3 wars. He handed me a flash drive and a thermos. The drive's the cleanest cut of your noise, he said. The thermos is for when you hear it. You decoded more? I asked. I decoded enough to make the hairs on my arms do a little dance, he said. We'll get to it when your other ghosts arrive. Other arrived 20 minutes later in a used sedan that had seen its share of highway miles. I watched from the front window as Charlie Carter unfolded himself from the driver's seat, shoulders a little slumped, tie slightly skewed, the weight of 2 lives hanging off him. Time had not been kind, but it hadn't been cruel either. It had done what it does to all of us, softened some angles, hardened others. His hair was thinner, his face more lined, but his eyes, when he looked up at my house, were immediately familiar. They'd always had that haunted depth to them, even before they had reason. Helen went stiff at my side. He really came, she said, like part of her had still expected a last-minute text saying something had come up, some meeting, some fear. Grief doesn't clock out just because you change zip codes, I said. Give him a minute. When I opened the door, Charlie stood on the porch with his hands jammed deep in his coat pockets, as if afraid they might betray him by reaching for something he couldn't have. For a second, we just looked at each other, the reporter and the father, 27 years and a lifetime of pain between us. Dan, he said, voice rougher than I remembered, you look older. So do you, I said. Come on in before the neighbors start thinking we're planning a coup. His laugh was short and humorless, but it cracked some of the ice. He stepped inside, eyes scanning the hallway, the living room, taking in the war room chaos with a mix of fatigue and wary curiosity. Helen emerged from the living room doorway. For a heartbeat, everything else in the house, the hum of the fridge, the creak of settling boards faded. Ex-spouses meeting under the banner of shared loss have their own gravity. Hi, she said. Hi, he answered. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Something in the angle of their bodies, in the way their gazes met and held for a second longer than strangers would tolerate, spoke louder than any gesture. Then they both did what people do when intimacy becomes too sharp to look at. They turned to the nearest neutral object. In this case, my walls filled with paper. You've been busy, Charlie said. Retirement hobby, I said. Some guys golf. I annoy metaphysical phenomena. Walt cleared his throat from the couch. An old radio men, he added. Introductions were made Walt to Charlie, Charlie to Walt, all under a thin layer of brittle small talk. Once everyone had a mug of coffee or tea and a cookie in hand, I clicked the remote, and the TV screen lit up with the waveforms from the tapes. If you're going to ask people to consider the unthinkable, giving them a graph to stare at helps. It makes the story feel anchored, at least a little, in something they can point to. We're not here to rewrite everything the sheriff's office did, I began. They worked the angles available to them with the tools and the mindset they had. But there's another layer now, One that, frankly, they weren't equipped to see. I'm going to play you some things. You've already heard one of them. I nodded to Helen. Molly's tape. Charlie's jaw tightened at the mention. She recorded something? He asked, voice already fraying. Hidden it, Helen said softly. Under her floor. We found it 2 days ago. I didn't, he swallowed. I didn't know she knew how. She knew more than we gave her credit for, I said. Listen, I played the For Later tape again. Even knowing what was coming, it hit me in the chest, the way her small voice threaded through the room, cutting across years. Charlie's reaction was different from Helen's, where she had gone still and glassy, tears flowing quietly. He came apart in little explosions, sharp inhales, hands pressing into his thighs hard enough to blanch the knuckles, a curse under his breath when she mentioned telling Dad not to be sad. When the taps came, the 3 knocks, then the more complex pattern, Walt leaned forward, eyes on the speakers as if sound might show itself visually if he stared hard enough. Charlie flinched at the first series, head jerking slightly toward the wall behind him, like an animal hearing a remembered threat. Helen reached out, almost unconsciously, and laid a hand over his. For a second, their fingers curled together like muscle memory. By the time the tape clicked off, the room felt charged again, like the air before a storm. Charlie wiped his face with the back of his hand, not bothering with pretense. She sounds so sure, he said hoarsely, like she knows, like she's saying goodbye without saying it. She was scared, Helen said, but she didn't want to scare us. So she scared the tape instead. Walt cleared his throat. The second pattern she tapped, he said, nodding toward the waveform frozen on the TV. It's not random. When Dan brought me the Search Night tape, I heard a similar structure under the girl's whisper outside the community center. Morse-like, but mapped more cleanly to coordinates than letters. When I cross-checked it against some old logs from a Leonid shower in '98, he gestured to the map on the wall. It lines up with a spot above Briarwood, where the meteor stream and Earth's magnetic field had a, let's call it a disagreement. Charlie stared at the map, then at Walt, then at me. You're telling me my daughter intercepted a transmission from space? He said, at 8, in her bedroom, with a toy tape recorder. I'm telling you she noticed something you and I and the whole sheriff's department ignored, I said. And she left us a record of it. The nature of that something is where it gets. Weird, he snorted weightily. We passed Weird 3 tapes ago. I took them through the rest. The Search Night recording with Molly's disembodied Mr. Hayes. The clicks underneath. The way the pattern matched her own taps. I told them about the knocks in Helen's hallway, the ones that answered, the anonymous texts and Eric Lawson's forthcoming visit, his dreams of the glowing bulletin board door. As we moved from one piece to the next, I watched Charlie's face shift, skepticism shading into reluctant curiosity, anger flaring at the idea that any of this had remained buried, sorrow deepening with every little confirmation that his daughter had been more aware of her fate than any child should be. So what are you saying? He asked finally, voice raw. That some thing in the sky reached down and plucked her out of our yard like a dandelion? That she's been, what? Floating? Stuck? On hold for 27 years while whatever it is gets its act together? I don't know, I said, and it felt good to say it plainly. I'm not a scientist or a priest. What I am is a man who spent his life listening for patterns in human messes. And this, I gestured at the walls, the tapes, the maps. This is a pattern. Something interacted with our town that night in a way we weren't capable of framing. It touched radios, tapes, dreams, a little girl's skin. It left fingerprints in knocks and coordinates. Whether you call that alien, angelic, dimensional, or just unknown, it's not nothing. And it's not done. Not done, Helen repeated softly. Because it's still knocking. And sending, Walt added. tapping the flash drive. When I cleaned up the signal under Molly's whisper on the search tape, it wasn't just one burst. There were echoes. Fainter, like whatever sent it was attenuating. But here's the kicker. When I compared it to some anomalous blips I picked up last month during a smaller meteor event, the pattern rhyme was there. Modified, like an echo of an echo. If you want my unqualified, unlicensed, old man with too many radios opinion, whatever lit up your town in '98 poked its head back into the neighborhood recently. Maybe passing by. Maybe checking in. Checking in on what? Charlie asked. On who? On cue, as if whoever or whatever it was appreciated dramatic timing, there were 3 soft knocks on my living room wall. Not loud, not aggressive. Just present. 1, 2, 3. All 3 of us froze. Helen's eyes went wide. Charlie's jaw clenched. Walt muttered, "Well, that's unsubtle," under his breath. The wall in question backed onto my small office, not the outside of the house. I'd lived here long enough to know which sounds belonged to pipes and which belonged to company. I stood, moved slowly to the wall, and pressed my palm against it. The wood felt no different, but my skin tingled. "You've got a terrible sense of occasion," I said quietly. "But I suppose you already know that. Who are you talking to?" Charlie asked, half exasperated, half unnerved. "The same guest who's been knocking on Helen's walls," I said. "The same one that apparently thinks floors are good hiding places. Watch." I knocked back. 1, 2, 3. Silence. Then, after a beat long enough to make us wonder if we'd imagined the first part, the reply came. 1, 2, 3. Helen's hand found Charlie's again. This time, he didn't pull away. "Okay," he said tightly. "Let's say I accept that. Something out there and something in here are playing Morse tag through our drywall. What do we do? Put out a welcome mat? Build a bigger antenna? How does this help us find her? Or, God help me, find out what's left of her?" Those were the questions at the core of all this, the ones no amount of graphs or ghost knocks could sidestep. I went back to the table, picked up the printed map Walt had sent, and laid it flat. "When I was younger," I said, "I thought stories were about answers. About finding the culprit, reeling the twist, tying the bow. The older I get, the more I think the real power is in naming the shape of a thing, giving it edges so it can't sneak up on you in the dark. For 27 years, you've been told a version of the story that goes, little girl, quiet street, unknown assailant, tragedy, cold case. It fit in a file. It fit on the news. It never fit in your chest. Now we know there was more in play. Forces call them cosmic. Call them whatever that brushed past your daughter at the exact moment she vanished. That doesn't absolve any human who might have taken advantage of that moment. But it means the frame was wrong. And sometimes, when you change the frame, you see pieces you missed before." "Like what?" Helen asked. "Like the stretch of woods where the dogs lost the scent," I said. I pointed to a marked area on the town map. "Like the power flickers recorded between 6:50 and 7:10 p.m. by 3 different households on Maple Lane, including your own. Like the way Eric Lawson's dream places the door at the bulletin board, the center of town's attention that night, where the signal was loudest. And like the fact that the coordinates in Molly's taps and Walt's logs both line up with a very specific overhead point. If this was a crossing, maybe there are other crossings. Other borrowings. You think there are more kids," Charlie said quietly. "Like her. I think Molly herself thought there might be," I said, remembering Eric's description of multiple voices behind the dream door. "And if that's true, then somewhere out there is a pattern of missing children, meteor events, and strange interference that no one has ever laid side by side. Not because it isn't there, but because no one thought to ask the sky to show up in the case files." Walt whistled softly. "You're talking about building a database God forgot to authorize," he said. "You know how many weird blips radio heads like me log and then shove in a drawer? Multiply that by every small town with a clear view of the stars and a bad year. It's a lot." Walt whistled softly. "You're talking about building a database God forgot to authorize," he said. "You know how many weird blips radio heads like me log and then shove in a drawer? Multiply that by every small town with a clear view of the stars and a bad year. It's a lot. Then we start small," I said. "Briarwood. November 5th, 98. One girl, one town, one sky. We map every odd report from that week, animals acting strange, lights in the woods, power surges, dreams, you name it. We talk to Lawson. We talk to the pastor. We talk to anyone whose memory still twitches when they hear the words meteor storm and Molly in the same sentence. We line it up. And then I tapped the coordinates on the map. If we're brave enough, we follow this up." "Up where?" Charlie asked. "You gonna book a rocket on your retirement pension?" "Not literally," I said. "But there are satellites that watch meteor streams. There are observatories that logged that storm. Data that sat on servers for years. I still know people who know people. If those readings show any anomaly, a density spike, an unexplained pause, anything, we'll at least know we're not reading tea leaves in vacuum." "And if it all comes back normal?" Helen asked. "Then we know we're dealing with something that doesn't leave fingerprints in the places we're used to looking," I said. "Which is scary, yes. But it also means the only truly solid traces left are here." I tapped the tapes. "And here." I touched my chest, then theirs. In the people who were close enough to feel it. The room was quiet for a while after that. Outside, a car drove by, oblivious. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and then gave up. Inside, 4 people and 1 old tape player shared a silence that was not empty, but full of grief, of possibility, of a strange, reluctant hope that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't done writing itself yet. Eventually, Walt broke it with a gruff. "Well, if we're going to poke God and the cosmos with a stick, we might as well do it properly. Gimme that flash drive back. I want another crack at those sidebands. And Hayes? When your Lawson fella gets here, I want him on record. If the sky's been whispering to him in his sleep, we need to know in what language." Charlie stood, rubbing his face like he could scrub off 27 years. "I need some air," he said. "Not running, not leaving, just air." Helen stood too. "I'll go with you," she said. "If that's okay." He looked at her for a long second, then nodded. "Yeah," he said. "It's more okay than I expected." They stepped out onto my porch together, 2 silhouettes framed against a sky already beginning to darken. From inside, I watched them stand side by side, neither touching nor retreating, looking up. Maybe they were scanning for meteors. Maybe they were just letting the cold remind them they were still here. I stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and lifted my gaze too. The first star of the evening blinked faintly overhead, followed by another and another. Somewhere beyond the thin blue lid of our atmosphere, streams of ancient dust were still carving invisible paths, intersecting fields and forces we barely understood. Somewhere, a little girl who'd once written "The Other Side of the Clouds" in a notebook might have gotten closer to that wish than anyone had a right to. For later, she'd called her tape. Standing there, listening to the faintest echo of knocks in my walls and the soft murmur of Helen and Charlie's voices outside, I realized that later had finally arrived. Not with the neat closure of a jury's verdict or the clean lines of a gravestone, but with questions big enough to swallow a small town, and maybe gentle enough to offer it back something like peace. The case of the missing child on Maple Lane would never fit in a single headline again. It had become, in its own strange way, A story about how small we are under the sky, and how loudly even the smallest voice can carry when it refuses to be forgotten. That night, after everyone left, the house felt too full to be empty. Walt had gone back to his radios, muttering about filters and sidebands. Helen and Charlie had returned, separately, to whatever temporary corners of the world they occupied when they weren't standing in my living room staring at walls and maps. The tapes were back in their cases, the flash drive tucked into a desk drawer, the map rolled up but not put away. I turned off the lights one by one, and each room seemed to exhale. Sleep didn't feel like an option, but lying in the dark and letting my mind chew itself to ribbons felt worse. So I did what I've always done when the world stopped making sense. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook and started writing as if someone, someday, would need a record of how it all felt from the inside. The words came slowly at first, then in heavier waves. The knock on my door in '98, the warmth of the bicycle frame, the first giggle in the parking lot. Every detail that had seemed meaningless back then, but now hummed with context. Around midnight, a soft rain began to fall, pattering lightly against the window over the sink. I got up to refill my mug and found myself staring out at the blurred shapes of my backyard, the maple tree, a darker smudge against the night. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves. I could almost see a small figure in a yellow raincoat dart across the lawn, hear her voice at my door. "Mom says it's okay if you come watch the meteor shower with us." Later, I told her that night, "I'll be right behind you." I'd meant it. I just hadn't understood how long later could stretch. 3 soft knocks behind me broke the reverie. 1, 2, 3. This time, it came from the direction of the front door. My whole body tensed, but it wasn't the cold spike of fear anymore. It was a strange, braced anticipation, like a man about to lift a curtain he's been staring at for too long. I walked slowly down the hall. The rain's gentle hiss followed me. At the door, I paused, hand on the knob. "You know," I said to the wood, feeling only a little foolish, "most people call ahead." I opened it. No one stood on the porch. The street beyond was slick and reflective, catching the glow of the street lamps in smeared halos. Water dripped steadily from the eaves. The only thing on the doormat was a small, clear plastic sleeve, about the size of a photograph, weighted at one corner with a smooth, dark stone. I picked it up. Inside the sleeve was a printout granny, clearly zoomed in from some larger image. It showed a patch of night sky, streaked with thin lines of light like scratches on film. At the center, circled in red ink, was a brighter flare, a tiny comma of luminescence that looked, to the untrained eye, like any other meteor. Along the bottom edge, in small typed letters, was a timestamp and a label, "Leonid stream over Briarwood, the 5th of November '98. Anomalous reflection." On the back, in the now familiar neat, anonymous handwriting, were 3 words. She wasn't alone. Something in my chest shifted. Not a break, exactly. More like a long-stuck joint finally popping back into motion. "Of course she wasn't," I murmured. "She never was." Not really. I slipped the photo out of its sleeve and held it up to the porch light. If you squinted, if you let your eyes unfocus just enough, you could see a faint smear trailing the circled meteor, a soft, ghostly doubling. Light reflecting off, what? Space junk? An invisible field? A child's borrowed outline? The rational mind reached for any label it could find. The part of me that had heard a little girl's laugh on a tape, 2 decades after she vanished, simply thought, there, that's where the story bent. I went back inside, closed the door gently, and laid the photo on the table next to Molly's tapes. Then I sat down, and for the first time in a long time, allowed myself to imagine an ending that wasn't just a question mark. Not a happy ending. This was not that kind of story. There were no miraculous reunions, no 8-year-old girl stepping out of a beam of light, frozen in time and untouched by 27 years. We were still 4 mortals in a small town, bruised by loss, tethered to a planet that spun under a sky full of indifferent fire. But there was, finally, an ending that acknowledged all the chapters, instead of pretending half of them hadn't happened. A few weeks later, with Helen's reluctant blessing and Charlie's careful input, I published something I'd never expected to write, a long, strange article that began as a true crime feature and drifted, unapologetically, into the realm of the unexplained. The editor at the Herald knew, younger, more cautious, had balked at first. Our readers want closure, she'd said. They want suspects, timelines, not cosmic metaphors. Our readers, I'd replied, have been lying awake for 27 years, wondering if they missed something right in front of them. I'm not offering closure. I'm offering an honest map of how big the hole really is. Against her better judgment, or maybe in line with a quiet curiosity she didn't want to admit, she ran it. Borrowed, The Night the Sky Took Molly Carter, ran on a Sunday, spanning 4 full pages in print and a special feature online. We included what we could, quotes from Helen and Charlie, anonymized accounts from Eric and other volunteers, old photos, scanned waveforms of the tapes with little captions that said things like, "Listen closely, with your rational brain and whatever else you've got. We didn't say aliens. We didn't say angels. We said something." And for once, it felt like enough. The reaction was loud. Some people were furious. How dare we drag God and space and ghosts into a case that had ruined real lives? How dare we suggest there was anything but human evil at play? Letters poured in, some accusing us of exploiting a tragedy, others accusing us of corrupting faith with science fiction. A few threatened to cancel subscriptions, as if anyone under 50 still read the paper because of that. But other letters arrived, too. A woman in another state who'd lost her son the night of a freak aurora, writing that for the first time she felt her private sense of wrongness reflected in print. A retired cop who admitted, under a pseudonym, that his radio had gone dead for 10 minutes the night a girl vanished in his town, and he'd spent 20 years telling himself the batteries had just picked a bad time. A cluster of amateur astronomers who sent us archived logs from meteor showers across the late 90s, highlighting odd blips they'd laughed off at the time. The most important reaction, though, wasn't in ink or pixels. It was in a small house on Maple Lane, where a woman who'd spent half her life in suspended animation finally allowed herself to talk about her daughter without clenching every muscle in her body against the possibility of being dismissed as hysterical. Where a man who'd once blamed himself for not leaving work early that night began to understand that even if he'd raced home in record time, he would have arrived under the same crooked sky. They still grieved. They always would. But the grief had a different color now, streaked with something like awe. You know what's strange? Helen said to me one afternoon months later, as we sat on her back porch watching the tree line soften into dusk. I don't dream about her being taken anymore. For years, every nightmare was someone's hand on her shoulder, a car door slamming, woods swallowing her up. Lately, when she shows up, she's just walking. Sometimes on that trail in the photo, sometimes on clouds like the ones she wrote about. She looks back, sometimes, but not like she's lost. More like she wants to see if we're still paying attention. We are, I said. Loudly, the knocks didn't stop. If anything, they grew less sporadic, more integrated, like a language Molly and her family were slowly relating together. 3 on the bedroom wall when Helen was having a bad day. 3 on my office door when I'd spent too long staring at old case files and not enough time stepping outside to feel the air. Once, during a particularly intense meteor shower, 3 knocks came from the ceiling above my bed, followed by a faint musical rattle that sounded suspiciously like glow-in-the-dark stars shifting in their glue. Show off, I muttered into the dark, not entirely displeased. As for me, I started teaching again, not in a classroom, but in small ways. A true crime podcast invited me on to talk about cases that break the mold. I'd expected to be the cautious voice of reason, tamping down the host's appetite for the sensational. Instead, I found myself defending the value of letting uncertainty breathe. Sometimes the most honest thing we can say, I told them, is that the story is bigger than we are, that there were more players than we can name, that a child stood at the intersection of forces we don't fully understand and left us clues in the only languages she had, taps, whispers, a cassette labeled for later. That doesn't make it less real. It makes it more. The episode got more downloads than anything I'd ever written had gotten readers. Different medium, same job. Tell the story straight, even when the line wiggles. On the 28th anniversary of Molly's disappearance, a small group gathered at the end of Maple Lane. No cameras. No speeches. Just a few people who'd been there at the start. Helen, Charlie, Eric, Walt, a handful of neighbors who still remembered the search lines and the coffee in the community center. We stood near the spot where her bicycle had lain, the asphalt now just another stretch of road. Above us, the Leonids were due again. Scientists had predicted a modest show this year. I'd always liked understatements. We didn't hold candles or release balloons. Instead, at Helen's suggestion, we each brought something small Molly would have liked. A star sticker, a drawing, a tiny plastic whale, a page torn from a book about constellations. We placed them at the base of the street lamp, not as offerings to some hungry sky, but as markers. Proof that she'd been here, that we'd been here, that this intersection of ground and air had mattered. As the first meteor streaked overhead, a quick, bright scratch against the night, Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. "Do you hear that?" She whispered. At first, I thought she meant the soft ooze of the group, the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement, the rustle of leaves. Then faintly, just under the threshold of ordinary sound, I caught it. 3 light taps. Not on any wall or floor this time. Not localized at all. More like inside the air itself, a tiny percussion in the bones. 1, 2, 3. I laughed, a little helplessly. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I do." "Show off," she murmured, and this time we both smiled. There are people who will read all this someday, if it ever gets off my worn pages and into anyone else's hands, and roll their eyes. They'll say we were grieving, primed to see patterns, desperate for meaning in a meaningless event. They won't be entirely wrong. Grief does tune you, makes you hear frequencies you'd rather ignore. But to dismiss everything as delusion is to do what we did back in '98, to assume the sky is just a backdrop, not a participant. Maybe, in some distant future, someone will explain what happened to Molly in the clean language of physics. They'll talk about resonant fields and quantum whatever, about temporary displacements and informational echoes. Maybe they'll even build machines that can track those borrowings, divert them, negotiate with them. Maybe some graduate student will write a thesis tracing a pattern of missing children, meteor events, and anomalous signals, and our small town will be a footnote, the Briarwood case, in a larger understanding of how thin the skin between worlds can be. If that day comes, I hope they also read a little girl's list in a notebook. Things I want to see. 1. Real meteor shower. 2. A whale. 3. The Grand Canyon. 4. The other side of the clouds. I hope they understand that. For at least one child on one street on one November night, the other side of the clouds wasn't just a metaphor. It was a destination. Brief, terrifying, wondrous. And that she, bless her, had the presence of mind to leave us breadcrumbs. As for me, I'm an old man now with more past than future, living on a street where the ghosts knock politely and the sky occasionally looks back. I've made my peace with not having every answer. What I have instead is this, A story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that refuses to close completely. An end that looks less like a period and more like an ellipsis. Because somewhere, on clear nights when the Leonids return, if you stand in the right place on Maple Lane and listen past the crickets and the distant highway, you can sometimes hear it. A faint giggle, the squeak of bicycle tires, a small voice saying a name with equal parts mischief and trust. Mr. Hayes? And if you answer, if you stand there under the impossible weight of the stars and say, "We're still here, kiddo. We're still listening," the knocks come. 1, 2, 3. After all these years, later has become now. And the coldest case in Briarwood isn't so cold anymore.